Hey guys, tonight we begin a journey back in time to a moment when Christmas wasn't about shopping malls or credit card bills. Imagine a world where there were no Christmas trees glittering in living rooms, no cards tucked into mailboxes, no gifts wrapped in shiny paper, no Santa Claus, no crackers to pull at dinner, nothing. Just church, just silence. But then one woman changed everything. A 17-year-old girl who couldn't even speak English when she arrived in a foreign land. And the luxury Christmas we know today. It all started with her courage to bring a single tree into a castle on a cold December night in 1800. Now, before we step into that world together, I want to ask you something. If this story speaks to you tonight, if it moves you, or makes you think differently about the holiday season, would you consider subscribing to this channel? Maybe hit that like button, or share this with someone who loves history as much as you do. And I'm curious, where are you right now as you listen to this? Are you tucked into bed in New York? Driving home from work in California? Cooking dinner in Texas? Drop a comment and let me know. I love hearing from you. Alright. Dim those lights, let the world outside fade away, and let me take you back to a time when Christmas was about to be reborn. Here's something most people don't realize. The Christmas you celebrate today with all its glitter and magic is barely 200 years old. That's it, just 2 centuries. Before 1837, when Queen Victoria took the throne in England, Christmas was nothing like what you know. There was no Mariah Carey singing about all she wants for Christmas, no department stores decorated with towering displays, no children writing letters to Santa. In fact, if you lived in England in the early 1800s, Christmas Day might pass by almost unnoticed. Just another winter day where you'd go to church, maybe have a slightly nicer meal than usual, and that was that. Gift giving, that happened on New Year's Day, not Christmas. And it certainly wasn't the elaborate affair we have now. Maybe you'd give your servants a few coins or your children a simple handmade toy, but the idea of spending months shopping for the perfect presents, wrapping them in decorative paper, and placing them under a tree, that would have seemed absolutely absurd. Let me paint you a picture of what December looked like before the luxury Christmas was born. If you were a working class person in London in the year 1800, December the 25th was just another day. You'd wake up early, maybe before dawn, and head to work. There were no holidays for you. The factories didn't close. The shops didn't shut their doors. Christmas was for the wealthy, and even they didn't make much fuss about it. The streets of London would be cold and grey. No twinkling lights strung between buildings. No carolers singing on street corners. No shop windows decorated with festive displays to tempt youth inside. Just the regular rhythm of life, maybe a bit colder, a bit darker, but otherwise unchanged. If you were lucky enough to be part of a wealthy family, you might attend church in the morning. The service would be solemn, focused entirely on the religious meaning of the day. The birth of Christ, yes, but delivered in serious tones, with none of the joy and celebration we associate with Christmas today. Then you'd return home for dinner. And here's where things get interesting. Because even among the rich, Christmas dinner wasn't the extravagant feast you might imagine. In northern England, families ate roast beef. In the south, it was goose. Turkey, that bird that had been brought to Britain from America centuries earlier, but it was still considered too expensive for most families. Only the truly wealthy could afford it, and even they didn't always choose it for Christmas. The meal would be nice, certainly better than what you'd eat on a regular day, but there was no Christmas pudding dripping with brandy sauce, no mince pies shaped like little stars, no crackers to pull with your family members, releasing tiny gifts and terrible jokes. Just a good meal, shared with your immediate family, and then the day would end. That was Christmas, simple, quiet, almost invisible. But here's what I find fascinating. While England was celebrating Christmas in this subdued, almost forgettable way, something completely different was happening in Germany. In Germany, Christmas was alive, it was magical. Families would bring entire evergreen trees into their homes and decorate them with candles, paper flowers, and sweets. Children would gather around these trees, their eyes wide with wonder as the candlelight flickered and danced across the branches. Gifts would hang from the tree itself, small treasures wrapped in coloured paper or tied with ribbon. The tradition came from a beautiful place, though. Germans believed that evergreen trees represented eternal life, a symbol of hope during the darkest, coldest time of the year. Decorating these trees was a way of celebrating not just the birth of Christ, but the promise that spring would return, that light would overcome darkness, that life would triumph over death. And in one particular region of Germany, a place called Mecklenburg-Strelitz, there was a tradition that was especially beautiful. Families would cut a large branch from a yew tree, place it in a wooden tub, and decorate it with candles, fruits, and small toys. Then on Christmas Eve they would gather around this branch, light the candles, and celebrate together. It was intimate, it was warm, it was full of love and light. Now, you might be wondering why I'm telling you all this. What does the German Christmas tradition have to do with the birth of luxury Christmas in England? Everything. Because in 1761 a young German princess named Charlotte left her home in Mecklenburg-Strelitz and travelled to England to marry a king. Her name was Charlotte Sophia. She was only 17 years old, and she was about to become Queen of England. Let me tell you about Charlotte's journey, because it's one of the most extraordinary stories you've probably never heard. Imagine being a teenager, living in a small German duchy, and suddenly being told that you're going to marry the King of England. A man you've never met, in a country where you don't speak the language, among people whose customs are completely foreign to you. Charlotte arrived in England on the September 7th, 1761. She met King George III at 3:30 in the afternoon. By 9 o'clock that same evening, she was married to him. Think about that for a moment. 6 hours. That's all the time she had between meeting this man and promising to spend the rest of her life with him. 6 hours to go from being Princess Charlotte of Mecklenburg-Strelitz to being Queen Charlotte of England, and she couldn't even speak English. I imagine that first night must have been terrifying for her. She was thousands of miles from home, in a palace filled with strangers who spoke a language she didn't understand, married to a man she'd just met. Everything familiar had been stripped away from her. Her family, her friends, her language, even her small German traditions that had made her feel safe and connected to home. But here's what I love about Charlotte. She didn't let that fear destroy her. Instead, she held on to the things that mattered to her. Her love of plants, her passion for music, her German Christmas traditions. These became her anchors in this strange new world. For almost 40 years, Charlotte lived in England, adapting to English ways, learning the language, raising 15 children with King George. But every December she remembered the Christmases of her childhood. The yew branches decorated with candles, the sweets hanging from the branches, the warmth of family gathered around that glowing tree. And in 1800 she decided to do something extraordinary. That year Charlotte was planning a Christmas party at Queen's Lodge in Windsor for local children. Now keep in mind this wasn't unusual. Wealthy families often hosted events for children during the Christmas season. It was considered charitable, a way of spreading goodwill during the holiday. But Charlotte wanted to do something different, something special, something that would transport these children just for a moment into the magical world of her German childhood. So she instructed her servants to bring in an entire yew tree. Not just a branch, but a whole tree. They placed it in a large wooden tub in the middle of her drawing room. And then Charlotte oversaw the decoration. Picture this scene with me. A grand room at Windsor Castle, filled with the soft glow of candlelight. In the centre, a yew tree reaching toward the ceiling. From its branches hang bunches of sweetmeats, almonds and raisins wrapped in colourful paper. There are small toys carefully tied with ribbon, and scattered throughout the tree, dozens of small wax candles, their flames creating a warm, magical light. One of the guests that night, a man named Dr. John Watkins, later wrote about what he saw. He described it as an immense tub with a yew tree placed in it, with branches decorated with sweets, almonds, raisins in papers, fruits and toys most tastefully arranged, and the whole illuminated by small wax candles. Can you imagine being one of those children? Walking into that room and seeing something you'd never seen before, a tree glowing with light, dripping with treasures. Watkins wrote that after the company had walked around and admired the tree, each child obtained a portion of the sweets which it bore together with a toy, and then all returned home quite delighted. Quite delighted. What beautiful, simple words to describe what must have been an unforgettable moment for those children. But here's the thing that breaks my heart a little bit. Despite how magical that night was, despite how revolutionary Charlotte's Christmas tree would eventually become, at the time nobody really paid attention. The tree was a novelty, yes. Something interesting that the Queen had done. The aristocratic families who'd been at that party might have mentioned it to their friends. A few wealthy families might have even tried to recreate it in their own homes. But to the average English person, it meant nothing. They had no idea this tree existed. They had no idea that Queen Charlotte had just planted the seed of what would become the most iconic symbol of Christmas. For 40 years after that night in 1800, Christmas trees remained a secret of the wealthy, something you might see at a fancy party if you were lucky enough to be invited, but certainly not something that regular people did in their homes. Why? Why didn't Charlotte's tree catch on? I think there are a few reasons, and they're fascinating when you think about them. First, there was the simple matter of access. If you were a working-class person in London, how would you even get a tree? You couldn't just drive to a Christmas tree lot and pick one out. Trees had to be cut from forests, transported to the city, and that cost money. Money that most families simply didn't have. Second, there was the question of space. If you lived in a small apartment or a cramped house, where exactly would you put an entire tree? It wasn't practical. The wealthy had drawing rooms and ballrooms where they could display these trees. Regular families had 1 or 2 rooms where they lived, worked, ate and sat. A tree would have been in the way. But I think the biggest reason Charlotte's tree didn't catch on was this. There was no media coverage, no viral moment, no way for the story of that magical Christmas night to spread beyond the small circle of people who had actually been there. Remember, this was 1800. There were no photographs, no television, no internet. News travelled slowly, through word of mouth or occasional mentions in newspapers, and the newspapers of that time, they barely mentioned Christmas at all. It simply wasn't considered newsworthy. So Charlotte's beautiful tradition remained hidden, known only to the royal family and their closest friends. She continued to put up a yew tree every Christmas for the rest of her life. She continued to decorate it with candles and sweets and small gifts. But the world beyond the palace walls went on celebrating Christmas the way they always had, simple and quiet and almost invisible. And here's the question that haunts me when I think about this story. How many other beautiful traditions have been lost to history because there was no way to share them? How many moments of magic happened in private homes, seen by only a handful of people, and then disappeared forever? Charlotte died in 1817, still holding on to her German Christmas traditions, still bringing that yew tree into Windsor Castle every December. But she died without knowing what her simple act would eventually become. She died without knowing that 4 decades later, another woman would pick up where she left off, a woman who happened to be her granddaughter, a woman who would have something Charlotte never had, the power of media, the magic of an image that could spread across an entire nation in days. That woman was Queen Victoria. But here's what I want you to understand before we get to Victoria's story, which we will in the next part of this journey. The luxury Christmas you celebrate today with all its excess and beauty and commercial madness, it didn't start with the idea of luxury at all. It started with homesickness, with a teenage girl far from home trying to recreate a moment of warmth and light in a foreign land. It started with Charlotte's courage to bring her traditions into a place that didn't understand them, to share something beautiful, even when nobody seemed to be paying attention. She planted a seed in the darkness of English winter, and though she never lived to see it, that seed would eventually grow into something extraordinary, something that would transform not just how England celebrated Christmas, but how the entire world did. Because here's the truth about traditions, they don't always catch fire immediately. Sometimes they smoulder for decades, waiting for the right moment, the right circumstances, the right person to fan them into flame. Charlotte gave us the spark, but it would take 40 more years and another German princess to create the inferno. So what changed between 1800 and 1840? What transformed the Christmas tree from a hidden royal secret into a global phenomenon? What made the difference between Charlotte's forgotten tree and Victoria's viral sensation? The answer is more fascinating than you might think, and it has everything to do with something that wouldn't be invented for another 150 years, the power of going viral. But before we get to that story, before we talk about the 1848 moment that changed Christmas forever, I want you to sit with Charlotte's story for a moment. Think about her courage, her persistence, her quiet determination to keep a piece of home alive in a foreign land, even when nobody seemed to care. Because that's where luxury Christmas really began. Not with money or extravagance or commercial excess, but with love, with memory, with a young woman's refusal to let the darkness of homesickness extinguish the light of her childhood traditions. In the next part of our journey, we'll see what happened when that light finally burst into flame, when one illustration in a newspaper created a Christmas revolution, when the luxury Christmas was finally truly born. But that's a story for the next chapter. For now, rest in the quiet of Charlotte's secret. Rest in the knowledge that sometimes the most important revolutions begin in silence, in small acts of courage that nobody notices at the time. Sleep well, and when you wake, we'll continue this journey together. What makes a tradition die and what makes it come back to life? You'd think that once something beautiful has been created, once a moment of magic has happened, it would naturally spread and grow. But history doesn't work that way. History is messy, full of false starts and forgotten moments, of seeds planted that don't sprout for decades. Charlotte's Christmas tree should have changed everything in 1800, but it didn't. And the reason why tells us something fascinating about how culture actually works, about what it really takes for an idea to go from a private moment in a palace to a tradition embraced by millions. Let's talk about what happened in those lost 40 years between Charlotte's tree and the moment when Christmas trees finally exploded into British consciousness. Because this is where the story gets really interesting. When Charlotte died in November of 1817, she had been Queen of England for 56 years. Think about that, more than half a century on the throne. She'd raised 15 children. She'd survived her husband King George III's descent into madness. She'd weathered political storms, personal tragedies, and the enormous pressure of being a public figure in a time when queens were expected to be seen but rarely heard. And through all of it, every single December, she put up her Christmas tree. Year after year after year, in Windsor, in Kew Palace, wherever the royal family happened to be, Charlotte made sure there was a tree glowing with candles, decorated with sweets and small gifts, a little piece of her German childhood transplanted into English soil. But here's what breaks my heart. When she died, most people in England had no idea this tradition even existed. The newspapers that announced her death talked about her charitable work, her patronage of the arts, her role as mother to the king's children. But they didn't mention the Christmas trees. Why would they? To the English press, it was just a quirky German custom that the royal family did in private. Nothing newsworthy, nothing special. Can you imagine spending 56 years doing something you love, something that brings you joy and connects you to your roots, and having nobody really notice, nobody really care? I wonder sometimes what Charlotte would have thought if she had known that her granddaughter would one day make this tradition famous. If she had known that millions of people around the world would eventually gather around Christmas trees every December, continuing what she started in that drawing room in 1800. Would it have comforted her? Or would she have found it bittersweet, knowing that she'd planted the seed but would never see the garden bloom? Now here's where the story takes a turn, because Charlotte did have one person who noticed, one person who cared, one person who would remember those magical Christmas trees long after Charlotte was gone. That person was a little girl named Victoria. Princess Victoria was born in May of 1819, about 18 months after her grandmother Charlotte died. So she never met the woman whose name she shared, never got to hear Charlotte's German accent or see her tend to her beloved gardens, or watch her light the candles on a Christmas tree. But she grew up surrounded by Charlotte's legacy. Victoria's mother, the Duchess of Kent, was herself German. From the House of Saxe-Coburg, one of those sprawling German royal families that seem to have branches in every court in Europe. And the Duchess made sure that her daughter grew up knowing her German heritage, speaking German as fluently as English, understanding the customs and traditions of that distant homeland, including the Christmas tree. When Victoria was 13 years old, she wrote something in her diary that gives me chills every time I read it. It was Christmas Eve, 1832. Victoria was at Kensington Palace, the place where she'd spent her entire childhood, often feeling isolated and controlled by her mother and her mother's advisor. But on this particular night she was excited, because it was Christmas Eve, and she knew what was coming. She wrote, "After Mama had rung a bell 3 times, we went in the dining room. There were 2 large round tables on which were placed 2 trees hung with lights and sugar ornaments, all the presents being placed round the trees. Can you picture it? A teenage Victoria, probably wearing one of those elaborate dresses they wore in the 1830s, waiting impatiently as her mother rang a bell 3 times. That was the signal. That was the moment when the doors would open and she'd see the trees. 2 trees, not just one. 2 large round tables, each with its own tree glowing with candlelight, decorated with sugar ornaments that sparkled in the flickering flames. And around the base of each tree, presents. Unwrapped presents following the German tradition, so you could see everything at once, all laid out in a dazzling display. This was how Victoria celebrated Christmas every year as a child. This was her normal, her tradition, her connection to a grandmother she'd never met, but whose legacy lived on in those glowing trees. And here's what I find so powerful about this moment. Victoria didn't know she was preserving history. She was just a girl excited about Christmas, writing in her diary the way teenagers do. She had no idea that one day people would read those words and understand how important they were. She had no idea that she would be the one to finally make her grandmother's dream come true. But before we get to that moment, before we talk about how Victoria and her husband Albert would transform the Christmas tree from a private royal tradition into a global phenomenon, I want you to understand something crucial about why Charlotte's tree didn't spread in her lifetime. It wasn't just about access or cost or space, though those things mattered. It was about something deeper. It was about the nature of culture itself, about how ideas spread, about what it takes for a tradition to catch fire. You see, in Charlotte's time, there was no mass media, no photographs, no illustrated magazines that could show people what a Christmas tree looked like. No way for an ordinary family in London or Manchester or Edinburgh to see what was happening inside the palace walls and think, "Oh, we want that too." There were newspapers, yes, but newspapers in the early 1800s were expensive, exclusive, read mostly by educated, wealthy men. They focused on politics, wars, trade, not on social customs or holiday traditions. Christmas was barely mentioned in the press at all. It was considered too religious, too personal, too insignificant for public discussion. So even though Charlotte put up a Christmas tree every year for almost 2 decades, even though aristocratic families who visited the palace might have seen it and been charmed by it, there was no mechanism for that image to spread beyond a tiny elite circle. The tree remained a secret, beautiful but hidden, known but not seen. And there's another reason too, a reason that's harder to talk about but just as important. Charlotte, for all her years on the throne, was never particularly popular with the British public. She wasn't disliked exactly, but she wasn't beloved the way her granddaughter Victoria would be. She was seen as foreign, German, a bit odd with her interests in botany and her menagerie of animals, and her insistence on speaking German at home even after 50 years in England. The British public in the early 1800s was suspicious of anything too German. England and various German states had complicated relationships, sometimes allies, sometimes rivals. And the royal family's German connections were already a source of tension. Some people thought the royal family was too German, not English enough. So even if Charlotte's Christmas tree had been widely publicised, it might not have caught on. It might have been dismissed as another one of those strange German customs that the odd German queen liked to do. Nothing that proper English families needed to adopt. But by the time Victoria came along, everything had changed. Victoria was born in England. She spoke English as her first language, even though she was fluent in German. She was young, fresh, exciting. When she became queen in 1837 at only 18 years old, the British public fell in love with her. She represented a new generation, a new start, a break from the old guard. And when she married Prince Albert in February of 1840, another handsome young German prince who was also her first cousin, the public was enchanted. This wasn't a political marriage arranged between strangers. This was clearly a love match. Victoria adored Albert, and the people loved watching them. Young love, royal romance, a beautiful couple starting their life together. It was the 1930s version of, well, whatever royal wedding you're thinking of right now, people couldn't get enough of them. But even with all that public interest, even with all that goodwill, it still took 8 years after their marriage before the Christmas tree finally broke through into public consciousness. 8 years during which Victoria and Albert celebrated Christmas privately, putting up their trees at Windsor Castle just like Charlotte had done, just like Victoria had grown up doing at Kensington Palace, following those German traditions that connected them to their roots. Albert, like Charlotte before him, was homesick for the Christmases of his childhood. He'd grown up in Coburg in Germany, where Christmas was a major celebration, where every house had a tree decorated with candles and cookies and small handmade ornaments, where families gathered on Christmas Eve to exchange gifts and sing carols and celebrate together. He missed that, and he wanted his children to have those same memories. So every year Albert would order spruce fir trees from Coburg, real trees shipped all the way from Germany to England. He'd personally supervise their decoration, working alongside Victoria to hang gilded walnuts and gingerbread cookies and small baskets filled with candies and delicate wax candles on every tier. They didn't have just one tree, they had several. One for Victoria, one for Albert, one for Victoria's mother, one for their children to share, one for the household staff, one for the servants, each tree placed in the centre of a table with presents arranged around its base. It was extravagant, it was beautiful. Beautiful. It was completely private. Until December of 1848. Now, I want you to think about this timing for a second. 1848. What was happening in the world then? Europe was exploding with revolutions. France, Germany, Italy, Austria all erupting in uprisings as people demanded more rights, more freedom, more say in their own governance. It was a time of massive social upheaval, of old orders crumbling, of new ideas spreading like wildfire, and newspapers, Those same newspapers that had ignored Christmas in Charlotte's time were becoming more powerful than ever. Literacy rates were rising, printing technology was improving, and most importantly, illustrated magazines were becoming popular. Magazines that could show you pictures of what was happening in the world, detailed engravings that brought faraway places and events right into your home. One of those magazines was called the Illustrated London News. It had started in 1842, just 6 years earlier, and it was revolutionary. Every week it published dozens of illustrations showing news events, society gatherings, exotic locations, whatever would capture readers' imaginations. And in December of 1848, one of their artists was invited to Windsor Castle to sketch the royal family's Christmas celebration. What he drew would change Christmas forever. But you know what? I don't want to tell you about that drawing yet, because there's something else we need to understand first, something about the artist himself, about his intentions, about what that image was meant to communicate. This wasn't just a picture of a Christmas tree, it was a political statement, a message about family values, about tradition, about the kind of monarchy Britain needed in those turbulent times. And the fact that this message happened to include a Christmas tree, that was almost an accident. A beautiful, world-changing accident. In our next part, we'll look at that famous illustration. We'll talk about why it spread so fast, what made it go viral in an age before social media. We'll explore how a single image could transform a hidden royal tradition into a global phenomenon practically overnight. But right now, I want you to sit with this moment, this turning point. Because somewhere in Windsor Castle in December of 1848, Victoria and Albert were decorating their Christmas trees, completely unaware that they were about to make history. They were just celebrating Christmas the way they always did, the way Victoria's grandmother Charlotte had taught the family to celebrate, with love, with light, with trees that connected them to their roots and their memories and their hopes for the future. They had no idea they were about to launch a revolution, a luxury revolution, a revolution that would turn Christmas from a quiet religious holiday into the magnificent, extravagant, beautiful mess we know today. And it all started with one drawing, one illustration, one perfect viral moment. We'll explore that moment next, but for now, rest in the knowing that sometimes the most important changes happen when we're not trying to change anything at all. When we're just living our lives, following our traditions, staying true to what matters to us. Charlotte planted the seed in darkness. Victoria watered it with memory and love. And in 1848, it was finally ready to bloom. December 23rd, 1848, a Thursday, 2 days before Christmas. Somewhere in London, a man named Herbert Ingram was preparing to release the latest issue of his magazine, the Illustrated London News. He had no idea he was about to change the world. Think about what it means for something to go viral today. You post a photo on Instagram. Within hours, thousands of people have seen it. Within days, millions. Within weeks, it's everywhere. People in Tokyo, in Sao Paulo, in Mumbai, all looking at the same image, all feeling the same emotions, all wanting to recreate what they've seen. Now imagine creating that same effect in 1848. No internet, no social media, no television, just paper and ink and wood engravings, and somehow against all odds, making a single image spread across an entire nation, across an entire ocean, transforming a culture in the process. That's what happened on December the 23rd, 1848. That's the day the Illustrated London News published an engraving by an artist named J.L. Williams. A simple image, a family gathered around a Christmas tree. But this wasn't just any family. This was the royal family. Queen Victoria, Prince Albert, and their children. And this wasn't just any Christmas tree. This was the tree that would finally, after 48 years, make Charlotte's dream come true. Let me tell you about this image, because understanding why it worked, why it spread, why it transformed Christmas from a private royal tradition into a global phenomenon. That's the key to understanding how culture actually changes, how ideas actually spread, how traditions actually take root. First, let's talk about the magazine itself, the Illustrated London News. When Herbert Ingram founded it in 1842, just 6 years before our story, he had a revolutionary idea. What if instead of just telling people about news events, you could show them? What if every major story came with an illustration, a detailed engraving that brought the event to life? It sounds obvious now, doesn't it? Of course, news should have pictures, but in 1842 this was radical. Newspapers were walls of text, dense, intimidating, aimed at educated, wealthy men who had the time and literacy to wade through endless paragraphs about politics and trade. Ingram wanted something different. He wanted a magazine that middle-class families could enjoy together, where a husband could read the articles, but his wife could look at the pictures, where children could gather around and see what was happening in the world beyond their own streets. And it worked. Oh, did it work? The first issue sold 26,000 copies. Within months, they were selling over 65,000 copies per week. By 1848, when our Christmas tree story begins, they were selling about 57,000 copies every single week. Now, that might not sound like much compared to modern social media. 57,000 people? That's a decent-sized Instagram following for a micro-influencer, nothing special. But here's what you have to understand. Each copy of the Illustrated London News wasn't read by just one person. It was shared, passed around, displayed in shop windows, read aloud in parlours. One copy might reach 10, 20, even 30 people. And the magazine was expensive. It cost sixpence. That doesn't sound like much until you realise that sixpence was about half a day's wages for a working-class person. This was a luxury item, something you saved up for, something special. So when you bought the Illustrated London News, you treasured it, you kept it, you showed it to your neighbours. Look what I have, look what I've seen. This is the world into which that Christmas tree illustration was released. A world hungry for images. Hungry for glimpses into the lives of the rich and famous, hungry for traditions they could adopt, rituals they could perform, ways to make their own lives feel more special, more meaningful, more beautiful. And Victoria and Albert, they were perfect for this moment, absolutely perfect. Let me paint you a picture of who they were in 1848. Victoria was 29 years old. She'd been queen for 11 years. She and Albert had been married for 8 years, and by 1848 they had 5 children. 5. The oldest, Victoria, was 8. The youngest, Louise, was just a baby. This wasn't some distant, unapproachable royal couple living in isolated splendour. This was a young family. Parents in their 20s and early 30s, surrounded by small children, trying to figure out how to balance duty and family, tradition and innovation, just like every other parent in England. People loved them, not just respected them, loved them. Albert especially was seen as the ideal husband, handsome, yes, but also devoted, faithful, deeply involved in his children's lives. He wasn't like the old kings who handed their babies off to nurses and nannies and rarely saw them. Albert played with his children, read to them, taught them, celebrated with them. And Victoria? She was head over heels in love with her husband. She wrote about him constantly in her diaries, called him her dear angel, relied on his advice, valued his opinion, shared power with him in a way that was revolutionary for the time. This was a love match. And Britain, fresh out of a rather grim period of royal marriages that were clearly political arrangements, absolutely ate it up. Absolutely ate. So when the Illustrated London News decided to do a feature on how the royal family celebrated Christmas, they knew it would be popular. But I don't think anyone, not Ingram, not the artist J.L. Williams, not even Victoria and Albert themselves, realised what they were creating. Now let's talk about the image itself. What did people actually see when they opened that magazine on December the 23rd? The engraving was published on page 409. It showed a family scene in an oval frame. At the centre, a Christmas tree. Not huge, maybe 8 feet tall, but beautifully decorated. 6 tiers of branches, each one holding a dozen wax candles. From the branches hung elegant trays, baskets, bonbonnières filled with sweetmeats, fancy cakes, gilt gingerbread, eggs filled with candy, all suspended by colourful ribbons. Around the tree stood the family. Victoria on the left wearing a crown, Albert on the right, his hand resting protectively on young Prince Arthur's shoulder. Between them, their children, little Victoria, young Bertie who would one day be King Edward VII, Alice, Alfred, and baby Louise in someone's arms, and in the corner, almost easy to miss, Victoria's mother, the Duchess of Kent, the woman who had raised Victoria with German traditions, the woman who had kept Charlotte's legacy alive. 3 generations, all gathered around a tree glowing with candlelight. Here's what made this image powerful. It wasn't showing you a grand royal ceremony. It wasn't showing you wealth or power or majesty. It was showing you a family, a mother and father and their children gathered together to celebrate, looking at each other, smiling, connected. The text that accompanied the image was just as important. It described the tree in loving detail. A young fir about 8 feet high, it said, with decorations of the most varied and expensive kind. But then it added something crucial. It said that this tree was prepared by Her Majesty's command for the royal children. For the children. This wasn't about showing off wealth. This was about creating magic for kids, about making Christmas special for the next generation. Can you imagine being a middle-class mother in London reading this? You've been trying to figure out how to make Christmas meaningful for your own children. You've heard vague rumours about German traditions, about trees and candles, but you've never actually seen one. You've certainly never thought about putting one in your own home, and then you see this image, the Queen of England, the most powerful woman in the British Empire, doing exactly what you wish you could do, creating magic for her children, following a tradition that connects her to her roots, her memories, her family history, and you think, I could do that. I could put up a tree, I could hang sweets from the branches, I could gather my children around and watch their faces glow in the candlelight. I could be like the Queen. This is the psychology of aspiration, and it's incredibly powerful. The image wasn't saying, look how rich we are. It was saying, look how much we love our children. And that's something every parent, rich or poor, could relate to, could want, could aspire to create in their own homes. Within weeks, the image had spread across Britain. People who couldn't afford to buy the Illustrated London News saw it anyway, in shop windows, at friends' houses, in discussions at markets and churches. And they wanted trees. Suddenly, everyone wanted trees. Forest owners in Germany couldn't keep up with demand. Ships crossing the Channel were packed with evergreen firs. By the early 1850s, you could buy Christmas trees in markets all over England. Small ones for modest homes, large ones for wealthy families, trees for everyone. The first advertisements for tree ornaments appeared in 1853, just 5 years after the image was published. Entrepreneurs recognized a market and rushed to fill it. Suddenly you could buy the manufactured decorations instead of making everything by hand. Suddenly Christmas tree decorating became an industry. But here's what really fascinates me. The image didn't just spread in England, it crossed the ocean. In December of 1850, 2 years after the original publication, a magazine called Godey's Lady's Book published the same image in America, with one crucial difference. They removed Victoria's crown, they removed Albert's royal sash, they edited out the royal symbols, making the scene look like it could be any wealthy American family rather than British royalty. Do you see the genius of that? The image worked in England because people wanted to be like the Queen, but in America, which had fought a war to escape British rule, you couldn't sell an image based on royal prestige. So they made it about something else, about family values, about tradition, about creating a beautiful, meaningful Christmas. And American families bought it, literally bought it. By the late 1850s, Christmas trees were becoming common in middle-class American homes. By the 1860s, they were everywhere. One image, one carefully composed illustration of a family around a tree, published on December the 23rd, 1848, and within a decade it had transformed Christmas in 2 countries. But we need to talk about what this actually meant, because it wasn't just about trees, it was about something much bigger, much more complicated. That image launched the commercialization of Christmas. Before 1848, Christmas was primarily a religious holiday, quiet, personal, inexpensive. You might have a nicer meal than usual, maybe exchange a few small gifts, but it wasn't a major economic event. After 1848, Christmas became big business. People needed to buy trees, decorations, candles, special foods, gifts to place under the tree, new clothes to wear for the celebration. The list went on and on. Entrepreneurs saw opportunity. Store owners created elaborate window displays. Manufacturers developed new products specifically for Christmas. Advertisers learned to associate their products with holiday cheer. The luxury Christmas had been born, and it would only grow from here. In the coming parts of our story, we'll explore what this meant. We'll talk about the Christmas card industry that exploded in the 1850s and 60s. We'll look at the food revolution that made Christmas dinner the elaborate feast we know today. We'll examine the role of women in all of this, both as consumers driving the market and as workers creating the products. But right now, I want you to sit with this moment, this turning point. December the 23rd, 1848. The day a simple image sparked a revolution. Victoria and Albert thought they were just sharing their family tradition, just showing the British public how they celebrated with their children. They had no idea they were creating a template that millions of people would follow, that billions of people would eventually follow. Charlotte had planted the seed in 1800. Victoria and Albert, 48 years later, finally gave it light. And once that seed had light, once people could see it and understand it and desire it, nothing could stop it from growing. The luxury Christmas was no longer a secret, it was a sensation, a movement, transformation of culture happening in real time. And the women who made it happen were just getting started with their stories. There's something magical about knowing the exact details of a moment that changed the world. Not just the big picture, but the small things, the intimate things, the human things that made it real. So let's step inside Windsor Castle on Christmas Eve 1848. Let's see what Victoria and Albert and their 5 children actually did on that night. Because understanding the reality behind that famous illustration, that's where the real story lives. It's late afternoon. The winter sun has already set. Outside Windsor Castle, the grounds are dark and cold. But inside there's warmth and light and the kind of electric anticipation that only children on Christmas Eve can generate. Victoria is 29 years old. Albert is also 29. They've been married for 8 years, and those years have been busy. Exhaustingly busy. 5 children in 8 years. Think about that for a second. 5 pregnancies, 5 births, 5 tiny humans who need constant care and attention. The oldest is Vicky, Victoria Adelaide Mary Louise. She's 8 years old, precocious and brilliant. She speaks 3 languages fluently, German, English and French. She's her father's favourite, the child who inherited his intellectual curiosity, his love of learning. Then there's Bertie, Albert Edward, 7 years old. And if Vicky is the easy child, Bertie is the difficult one. He doesn't like studying. He'd rather play. His parents worry about him constantly, comparing him to his perfect older sister and finding him wanting. Poor Bertie. He has no idea yet that he'll one day be King Edward VII, or that he'll actually turn out to be a rather good king despite his parents' concerns. Alice is 5, quiet, thoughtful, sensitive. She's the child. Always Mrs. Earl, who notices when someone is dead, who tries to comfort them. Sweet Alice, who will grow up to nurse her father when he's dying, and who will die herself at only 35 from the same disease that killed him. Alfred is 4. Affy, as the family calls him, the mischievous one, the prankster, always taking things apart to see how they work, always getting into trouble. He's Albert's second son, and already it's clear he's not going to be as easy to manage as his father would like. And then there's baby Louise, born just 9 months ago, in March of 1848. She's too young to understand Christmas, too young to remember this night. But she's there, probably being held by a nursemaid, gurgling and cooing and stealing everyone's attention the way babies do. 5 children, 5 distinct personalities, 5 little lives unfolding in the golden glow of palace life. But here's what makes this night special. Here's what makes it different from every other Christmas Eve they've celebrated. Somewhere in one of the rooms at Windsor Castle, an artist is setting up. His name is J.L. Williams. He's been commissioned by the Illustrated London News to sketch the royal family's Christmas celebration. He's nervous. You would be too, wouldn't you? Trying to capture the most famous family in Britain in an intimate moment. Victoria and Albert know he's there. They've agreed to let him observe and sketch because they understand something important. They understand that their Christmas traditions, their German customs, could benefit from being shared with the British public. They understand the power of image, of example, of showing rather than telling. This is marketing, if we're being honest. Brilliant, subtle 19th century influencer marketing, but unlike modern influencers who stage perfect moments for Instagram, Victoria and Albert are genuinely celebrating the way they always do. The artist is just documenting what's already happening. So what happens? It's Christmas Eve, not Christmas Day. This is crucial. This is one of the German traditions that Albert brought with him and that Victoria has embraced. In Germany, Christmas celebration happens on Heiligabend, Holy Evening, the 24th of December, not the 25th. For most English families in 1848, Christmas Day is the big event. But for Victoria and Albert's family, the magic happens on Christmas Eve. The children have been kept away from the main drawing room all day. This is part of the tradition, part of the anticipation. They know something special is being prepared, but they don't know exactly what. In that drawing room, servants have been working under Albert's supervision. Because Albert doesn't just order the tree to be decorated. He decorates it himself. With Victoria, this is their project, their creation. They've arranged for the tree to be cut from Windsor Great Park, a young fir about 8 feet tall, perfect size for a room, tall enough to be impressive but not so large that it overwhelms the space. The tree stands at the centre of the room, placed in a large tub so it's stable. Around its base, servants have arranged a table covered with white cloth, and on that table, spread out in careful display, are presents. Not wrapped. This is another German tradition that confuses English visitors. In England, if you gave gifts, you wrapped them. But in the German tradition of Bescherung, the gifts are displayed unwrapped so everyone can see them at once. It's about abundance, about the visual impact of plenty, and what gifts they are. For Vicky, there are books, always books for Vicky. She devours them. There's probably a doll too, because even brilliant 8-year-olds like dolls. Maybe a small jewellery box, something pretty but appropriate for a child. For Bertie, there might be toy soldiers. Boys loved toy soldiers in 1848. Maybe a wooden horse, something to encourage the physical play he loves, since he's not interested in his sister's academic pursuits. For Alice and Affy, more toys, simpler ones for their ages, a pull toy perhaps, a stuffed animal, building blocks, things that will delight and occupy them. And for baby Louise, she's too young for much, maybe a silver rattle, something symbolic that she won't remember, but that will be kept as an heirloom. But the gifts aren't just for the children. Victoria and Albert have gifts for each other too. Victoria probably has a painting for Albert, or a piece of sculpture, or a rare book for his collection. Albert has jewellery for Victoria. He always gives her jewellery. Brooches, bracelets, necklaces, beautiful pieces that she'll treasure and wear and that will eventually become part of the royal collection. And all of these gifts are arranged on that table around the base of the tree, a feast for the eyes, a display of abundance and love and family connection. But the tree itself, that's the real masterpiece. 6 tiers of branches, on each tier a dozen small wax candles, 72 candles in total, all waiting to be lit. Can you imagine the fire hazard? Can you imagine doing that today? Setting up 72 open flames on a dried tree in your living room? But in 1848, this is how it's done. This is the tradition. And the effect when those candles are lit must be absolutely stunning. Hanging from the branches are elegant trays and baskets filled with sweetmeats, bonbonnieres, fancy cakes, gilt gingerbread. Some of these treats are tied to the branches with coloured ribbons. Others rest in small containers that dangle and sway, catching the candlelight. There are eggs too, not real eggs, but decorative eggs made of sugar or marzipan, filled with more sweets, painted in bright colours. They hang from ribbons like ornaments. Everything sparkles, everything glows. Everything catches the light and throws it back in 1,000 directions. This is what Victoria and Albert have created. This is what they're about to share with their children. Now here's where it gets interesting. The Duchess of Kent, Victoria's mother, is also at Windsor for Christmas. She's been a complicated presence in Victoria's life. When Victoria was a child, the Duchess was controlling, domineering, kept Victoria isolated from other children, from normal experiences. Victoria didn't have a happy childhood, and a lot of that was because of her mother. But now Victoria's an adult, a queen, a mother herself, and time has softened some of those old wounds. Not healed them exactly, but softened them. The Duchess is getting old. She's 62 in 1848, that's genuinely old. And Victoria, despite everything, still loves her mother, still wants her to be part of these family celebrations. So the Duchess is there, standing a bit apart in the illustration we know, but present, witnessing her grandchildren, seeing the German tradition she brought with her continue in the next generation. 3 generations, all gathered around a tree, all connected by these traditions that came from Germany, from Charlotte's time, from memories and love and the desire to create something beautiful. Finally, the moment arrives. The children are summoned. A bell rings 3 times, just like Victoria remembered from her own childhood. That's the signal. That's when you know the doors are about to open. Can you imagine Vicky and Bertie and Alice and Affie lined up outside the drawing room, practically vibrating with excitement, trying to peek through the door, trying to guess what's inside? The doors open and they see it. The tree, glowing with 72 candles, dripping with treats and decorations, and at its base on that white-clothed table, all their presents laid out like treasures. I wonder what sounds they made. Did they gasp? Did they squeal? Did they run straight for the tree, or did they approach it slowly in awe? The historical record doesn't tell us, but we know what happens next. The family gathers around the tree. Victoria and Albert and the Duchess and the children, probably some of the household staff too, because Victoria always includes her closest servants in celebrations. She believes in sharing joy, in making Christmas special for everyone in her household. They might sing carols. German carols, probably, the ones Albert loves. O Tannenbaum, perhaps. Stille Nacht, which we know as Silent Night. And then the presents. Each child gets to collect their gifts from under the tree. They don't unwrap anything because there's nothing to unwrap, but they exclaim over each item, showing their siblings, thanking their parents. Victoria and Albert exchange their gifts. They might present them to each other formally, the way royalty does, with a little ceremony, a little speech about what the gift means. The Duchess watches, smiles, remembers her own childhood in Germany, her own Christmas trees decorated with candles and sweets, sees her daughter, now a queen, now a mother, continuing these traditions. And somewhere in the corner, probably trying to stay invisible, J.L. Williams is sketching frantically, trying to capture this moment. The arrangement of the family, the glow of the candles, the expressions of joy on the children's faces. He can't capture everything, of course. He can't capture the sound of children's laughter, the smell of evergreen and candle wax and gingerbread, the warmth of the room, both physical warmth from the fire and emotional warmth from the love that fills the space. But he captures enough to create an image that will speak to millions of people, enough to show them what Christmas could be, what family could be, what tradition and luxury and love look like when they come together. Here's what strikes me most about this night. It's not the expense, though there is expense. It's not the extravagance, though there is extravagance. It's the intentionality. Victoria and Albert are creating memories on purpose. They're taking German traditions seriously. They're making Christmas matter in a way it hasn't mattered in England for a long time. They're showing their children that celebration is important, that beauty is important, that taking time to create moments of magic is important, especially when you're busy with the responsibilities of running an empire. And they're doing all of this while being observed, while being documented, while knowing that what happens in this room tonight might influence how thousands, maybe millions of other families can celebrate Christmas. That's a lot of pressure, isn't it? But looking at the illustration that J.L. Williams creates, you don't see pressure. You see joy, you see connection. You see a family that genuinely loves being together, that genuinely treasures these traditions. Maybe that's why the image worked. Maybe that's why it spread so fast and so far, because it wasn't fake. It wasn't staged for the camera, except in the most basic sense of arranging people so the artist could see them. It was real. A real family. Really celebrating. Really believing in the importance of what they were doing. And when people saw that image 2 days later in the Illustrated London News, they didn't just see a royal family showing off their wealth. They saw themselves, or rather they saw what they wanted to be, what they wanted to create in their own homes with their own families. That's the magic of aspiration. Not envy of someone else's possessions, but recognition of shared values. Not wanting what someone else has, but wanting to create your own version of the joy they're experiencing. Victoria and Albert weren't saying, "Look how rich we are." They were saying, "Look how much we love our children. Look how much these traditions matter to us. Look how Christmas can bring a family together." And millions of people responded by saying, "Yes, we want that too." In our next part, we're going to explore what happened after that image was published. How quickly did Christmas trees actually spread? What did the first commercial Christmas tree lots look like? How did entrepreneurs capitalize on this new craze? And most importantly, what role did women play in all of this, both as consumers driving the market and as workers creating the products? But for now, let this scene rest in your imagination. 5 children gathered around a glowing tree on Christmas Eve, 1848, not knowing that they're making history, just knowing that they're happy, that they're loved, that Christmas is magical. Sometimes that's enough, sometimes that's everything. Picture this, it's early December 1851, just 3 years after that famous illustration was published. You're walking through Covent Garden Market in London, and you stop dead in your tracks, because there, lined up in rows like soldiers, are dozens of evergreen trees. Fir trees, spruce trees, pine trees, all cut and waiting to be sold, all destined for living rooms across London. Christmas trees, for sale, just like that. 3 years, that's all it took. 3 years from that illustration hitting the Illustrated London News, to entrepreneurs figuring out there was money to be made in selling evergreen trees during December. Think about how fast that is. How quickly an entire industry can spring up when people suddenly want something they didn't even know existed a few years ago. This is the moment when Christmas stopped being just a religious holiday or a family tradition and became big business. when clever business people looked at Victoria and Albert's tree and thought, I can sell that. I can make money from that desire, from that aspiration, from that need people have to create magic for their children. And oh, did they ever? Let's talk about what happened in those years right after 1848. Because it's not just about trees appearing in markets. It's about an entire ecosystem of businesses, products and services springing up practically overnight. It's about the birth of the Christmas economy as we know it. First, the trees themselves. Before 1848, if you wanted a Christmas tree in England, you had exactly two options. You could cut one down yourself if you happened to own land with evergreen trees, or you could be royalty and have one imported from Germany at great expense. That was it. There was no Christmas tree industry because there was no demand for Christmas trees outside of a tiny elite circle. But after that illustration, after millions of people saw that family gathered around a glowing tree and thought, I want that, suddenly there was demand. Massive demand. Demand that nobody had predicted and nobody was prepared for. The first entrepreneurs to spot this opportunity were German merchants already living in England. They had family connections back in Germany, in the Black Forest region where evergreen trees grew abundantly. They knew how to arrange for trees to be cut, shipped across the English Channel and sold in British markets. And they moved fast. By 1851, according to the contemporary accounts, you could buy Christmas trees at Covent Garden Market, at various street markets around London, even from travelling vendors who would go door to door in middle-class neighbourhoods. Fresh Christmas trees, beautiful faux fir trees for your home, just like the Queen's. Can you imagine being one of those vendors? Can you imagine the conversations? Why would I want a tree in my house? Haven't you seen the illustration? The royal family has a tree. It's the modern way to celebrate. Think of your children's faces when they see it glowing with candles. And people bought them, of course they did. Because Victoria and Albert had shown them what was possible, had created a template for family celebration that felt both traditional and excitingly new. But here's where it gets really interesting. The trees were just the beginning. Once you had a tree in your house, you needed decorations, and suddenly there was a whole industry ready to supply them. The first advertisements for manufactured Christmas tree ornaments appeared in 1853, just 5 years after the illustration. 5 years from nobody has a Christmas tree to here are mass-produced decorations you can buy to put on your Christmas tree. These early ornaments were imported from Germany, from the same regions that were supplying the trees. German craftsmen, particularly in a town called Lauscha in Thuringia, had been making blown glass ornaments for decades, but only for the German market. Suddenly they had customers in England desperate for their products. The ornaments were beautiful. Delicate glass balls in bright colours, silver and gold and red and blue. They caught the candlelight and threw it back in 1,000 directions, exactly like the decorations people had seen in that illustration of Victoria's tree. And they were expensive, at least at first. A set of a dozen glass ornaments might cost as much as a week's wages for a working-class family. But the middle class, they could afford them, and they bought them eagerly, because having manufactured ornaments from Germany meant your tree looked more like the Queen's tree. More sophisticated, more luxurious, more correct. Do you see what's happening here? The definition of a proper Christmas is being created in real time, and it's being created by commercial interests as much as by tradition or religion. Then there were the candles. Because Victoria's tree had been lit with dozens of small wax candles, and if you wanted your tree to look like hers, you needed candles too. Chandlers, the people who made and sold candles, suddenly found themselves with a new market. Not just candles for lighting homes or churches, but special small candles designed specifically for Christmas trees. Candles that could be clipped or tied to branches. Candles in festive colours. And yes, these were absolutely a fire hazard. Houses did burn down because of Christmas tree candles. It happened often enough that newspapers regularly published warnings during the Christmas season. Take care with your Christmas candles. Do not leave them burning untended. Keep water nearby. But people did it anyway, because the glowing tree, the magical tree, the tree that looked like the illustration, required candles, risk and beauty all tangled together. By the mid-1850s, the Christmas tree phenomenon had spread beyond London. Provincial cities, towns, even villages were starting to see Christmas trees. The railways made this possible, both by transporting trees from ports to inland areas and by allowing city workers to travel home for Christmas, bringing new traditions with them. And the United States, remember that modified illustration in Godey's Lady's Book in 1850? Within a decade, Christmas trees were becoming common in middle-class American homes too. German immigrants who had brought the tradition with them years earlier found that suddenly their custom was fashionable, desirable, American. By 1860, it's estimated that tens of thousands of Christmas trees were being sold annually in Britain alone, tens of thousands, from 0 to tens of thousands in 12 years. But let's talk about who was actually buying these trees, because that's where the story gets complicated. The working class, the people who made up the majority of the population in industrial Britain, mostly couldn't afford Christmas trees. Not real ones with manufactured decorations. The trees themselves were expensive enough, but add in ornaments and special candles, and you were talking about a significant investment. What working-class families did instead was creative and resourceful. They would cut branches from any available evergreen, holly or ivy. Bring those inside, maybe tie some ribbons to them, hang a few homemade paper decorations, create a scaled-down version of the luxury they'd heard about but couldn't afford. Or they would pool resources. Several families in a tenement building might go in together to buy one small tree which they'd set up in a common area so all the children could enjoy it. The Christmas tree, from its very beginning as a commercialized tradition, was tied to class and economics. It was aspirational. It was a marker of middle-class status. It was a way of saying we're doing well enough to spend money on something beautiful but ultimately unnecessary. That's what luxury always is, isn't it? The unnecessary made necessary by desire. Now, let me tell you about one particular businessman who understood this better than anyone. His name was F.W. Woolworth. Now, Woolworth doesn't start his Christmas ornament business until later, in the 1880s, but his story is worth telling because it shows how the Christmas industry continued to evolve and expand. In 1880, Woolworth was running variety stores in America. One day, he saw some German glass ornaments and thought, "These are beautiful, but they're too expensive for most people. What if I could import them in bulk and sell them cheap enough that even working families could afford them?" He bought $25 worth of ornaments, just $25. That was his test, to see if there was a market for affordable Christmas decorations. They sold out in 2 days, so he bought more and more. Within a decade, Woolworth was importing over 200,000 ornaments annually from Germany, over 6,000 different designs, creating variety and choice at price points that finally made Christmas tree decorating accessible to the working class. This is how luxury becomes democratized, how something that starts as exclusive gradually becomes available to everyone, not through generosity or social reform, but through capitalism. Through someone realizing that there's more money to be made selling cheap things to many people than expensive things to a few. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Let's go back to the 1850s, to those early years when the Christmas tree industry was just finding its feet. Because it wasn't just about trees and ornaments. The entire Christmas season was being reinvented, commercialized, packaged, and sold. Shopkeepers learned to create Christmas window displays, elaborate scenes featuring toys, decorations, winter landscapes made from cotton wool for snow. These displays weren't just about showing what was for sale. They were about creating atmosphere, creating desire, making people stop and stare and want to bring that magic into their own homes. The department store, which was just emerging as a new form of retail in the 1850s and 60s, was perfectly positioned to capitalize on Christmas. Here were big stores with lots of space, lots of inventory, lots of variety. They could dedicate entire floors to Christmas goods, could create an immersive shopping experience that made buying Christmas presents feel like an adventure. Toys, which had previously been handmade and expensive, started to be mass-produced. Factories churning out dolls, toy soldiers, wooden horses, games, at prices that middle-class families could afford. Creating a new tradition, the idea that children should receive multiple presents at Christmas, not just one special gift. Food too became commercialized. Specialized Christmas foods that you were supposed to buy and serve. Mince pies, Christmas puddings, candies shaped like fruit or flowers. Things you could make at home, certainly, but why would you when you could buy them pre-made from a shop? The message was consistent. Christmas should be abundant. Christmas should be luxurious. Christmas should involve spending money to create magic. And people, by and large, believed it, embraced it, saved up all year to afford a proper Christmas, went into debt sometimes to give their families the kind of Christmas they thought they were supposed to have. This is where we start to see the tension that still exists around Christmas today. The tension between what Christmas is supposed to mean, religiously and spiritually, and what it's become economically and commercially. There were critics even then, people who said that Christmas was being ruined by commercialism, that the focus on gifts and decorations and expenditure was obscuring the religious meaning of the holiday, that families were going into debt to keep up with expectations that were manufactured by retailers trying to make money. Charles Dickens, interestingly, wrote about this tension. His A Christmas Carol, published in 1843, 5 years before the famous tree illustration, emphasizes charity and generosity and family connection. Not expensive gifts or elaborate decorations, but human warmth, human kindness. And yet Dickens's Christmas also involves feasting. Bob Cratchit's family has their goose, their Christmas pudding, their special meal. There's still consumption, still expenditure, just framed in terms of family joy rather than showing off or keeping up with the neighbours. The truth is, there's no easy answer to this tension, because Christmas, as it evolved in the Victorian era and continues today, is genuinely both things. It's both a time for family connection and spiritual reflection, and an economic engine that drives retail sales and employs millions of people. The luxury Christmas that Charlotte dreamed of, that Victoria popularized, that entrepreneurs commercialized, is complicated, beautiful and excessive, meaningful and manufactured, spiritual and material all at once. In our next part, we're going to zero in on one specific aspect of this commercialization that often gets overlooked. We're going to talk about the women who bought the trees and decorations, the women who decided what Christmas would look like in their homes, the women who had the power to make or break these new commercial ventures, and the women who worked, often in terrible conditions, to produce the goods that made luxury Christmas possible. Because if men built the Christmas industry, women powered it, as consumers and as labourers, and their story is just as important as Victoria's. But for now, rest in this image. Covent Garden Market, December 1851. Rows of evergreen trees waiting to be sold. The smell of pine and commerce mingling in the cold winter air. The birth of an industry. The transformation of a holiday. The moment when tradition and capitalism shook hands and created something new. Sometimes beautiful, sometimes troubling, always fascinating. Here's something the history books often miss. While Queen Victoria was posing with her tree in 1848, there was another woman standing in a London shop holding a glass ornament in her hand, making a decision that would change everything. Her name was Elizabeth. She was 32 years old, the wife of a clerk, and in her hand was 3 weeks of careful savings. That ornament cost 6 shillings. To put this in perspective, her husband earned about £2 a week. That single glass ball represented 1/10 of their entire weekly income. But Elizabeth bought it anyway, Because here's what no one talks about when they discuss the Victorian Christmas Revolution. It was women who turned a royal tradition into a global industry. Not just queens, not just the wealthy. Regular middle-class women who controlled something incredibly powerful, the family purse. Let me show you how this actually worked. In Victorian England, there was an unspoken rule about money. Men earned it. Women spent it. This wasn't considered trivial. This was power. Power. A middle-class wife in 1850 didn't have the right to vote. She couldn't own her own property if she was married. She couldn't pursue most professions. But she could decide whether the family bought beef or mutton, whether they needed new curtains, whether that Christmas tree was worth the investment. And Victorian husbands, they largely stayed out of it. Dr. Isabella Beeton, who published her famous book of household management in 1861, made this crystal clear. The mistress of the house is the chief purchasing officer of the home. She didn't just choose what to buy. She negotiated prices, managed accounts, and decided which merchants got the family's business. This was real economic power, and at Christmas it became transformative. Think about what happened in that decade after the Illustrated London News published Victoria's Tree. Between 1848 and 1858, the Christmas ornament industry exploded. But not because men suddenly decided families needed decorations, because women did. Here's a specific example. In December 1853, just 5 years after that famous illustration, the Times of London ran its first advertisement for Christmas tree ornaments. German merchants were importing blown glass baubles, gilt gingerbread, wax angels. The ad was addressed specifically to the ladies of London. Why? Because merchants knew who made the decisions. By 1855, Covent Garden Market had entire stalls dedicated to Christmas decorations. Women would arrive in the morning, examine ornaments, compare prices, negotiate bulk purchases. One merchant's diary from 1856 records selling 247 glass ornaments in a single December morning to 183 different women, each one making a choice, each choice building an industry. But here's where the story gets more complex, more real. Because while Elizabeth was buying that ornament in London, another woman was making it, 3,000 miles away in Lauscher, Germany. Her name was probably Anna or Marie. She was probably 16 or 17 years old, and she worked 14 hours a day in a glass factory, blowing air through a hollow iron pipe to create those perfect spheres that middle-class English women would hang on their trees. She earned about 3 marks a week. That's roughly 9 shillings, barely more than the cost of 2 ornaments she made. This is the part of the Christmas story that makes us uncomfortable. The luxury Christmas that women bought was made by women who could never afford it themselves. Let me paint you a picture of Lauscher in 1850. This tiny town in the Thuringian forest had discovered something valuable. They could blow glass thin enough to be affordable, beautiful enough to be desirable. By 1855, 47 families in Lauscher were making Christmas ornaments. By 1860, over 200. And the workers, mostly women and girls, they worked in cramped workshops. The air was thick with glass dust. The furnaces burned all day, making the rooms unbearably hot even in December. These women would sit for 12 to 14 hours, their faces inches from flame, creating beauty they would never own. A skilled glassblower could make perhaps 60 ornaments in a day. Her weekly production, 300 to 400 pieces, her weekly wage barely enough to feed herself. Now here's what's fascinating. These weren't factory workers in the modern sense. Lauscher operated on what was called the cottage industry system. The glass merchants provided the materials. The women worked in their own homes or in small workshops with their mothers, aunts, sisters. They got paid by the piece, which meant they had flexibility. It also meant they had no protections. If you broke an ornament, you didn't get paid for it. If you couldn't work because you were ill, you earned nothing. If the merchant decided your work wasn't good enough, he could refuse the entire week's production. But here's the thing. These women didn't see themselves as exploited. Many of them saw this as their best option. A woman in Lauscher could earn more making ornaments than she could in service, more than she could doing laundry, more than she could in the textile mills that were springing up across Germany. Was it enough? No. Was it fair? Absolutely not. But it was their path to economic independence in a world that offered women very few paths at all. Now let's return to England, because something fascinating was happening there too. The Christmas industry wasn't just about buying, it was about selling, and increasingly the sellers were women. By 1860, London had over 15,000 shops. About 30% of them were owned or operated by women. Widows who inherited their husbands' businesses, daughters who took over from aging fathers, and increasingly women who simply saw an opportunity and took it. Take the case of Sarah Heckford. In 1862, she opened a shop on Oxford Street selling Christmas goods and seasonal necessities. Her initial investment, £12 borrowed from her brother. Within 2 years, she was earning £40 annually. That's more than many clerks made. What was she selling? Christmas cards, which had just been invented in 1843, decorative candles, ribbons and tinsel, and yes, German glass ornaments, which she purchased wholesale and sold at a 50% markup. She hired 3 shop girls, all women. They worked from 8 in the morning until 9 at night during the Christmas season, 6 days a week. They earned 4 shillings a week plus room and board. Was this exploitation? By our standards, absolutely. By Victorian standards, these shop girls had steady employment, a roof over their heads, and the respectability of working in trade rather than in service. Here's what's remarkable. The Christmas shopping season was creating a new category of working women, temporary Christmas staff. In November and December, stores would hire additional workers, women who needed seasonal income, widows, unmarried women, married women whose husbands' wages weren't quite enough. The Times of London in December 1865 ran advertisements seeking respectable women for temporary positions in the Christmas trade. One department store, Whiteley's, hired 72 additional staff for the 1865 season. 61 of them were women. This was revolutionary. These weren't factory workers hidden away in mills. These were women in public, interacting with customers, handling money, making sales. And the customers, mostly other women. So you had this fascinating dynamic. Women with purchasing power, creating demand, women with entrepreneurial skills, meeting that demand, women with economic need, labouring to supply that demand, all orbiting around Christmas. But let's be honest about the economics. The money flowed upward. The ornament maker in Lauscher earned a few shillings. The shop girl in London earned 4 shillings a week. The shop owner might earn £40 a year. The wholesale merchant, he might clear £300 annually. Notice I said he, the wholesale merchants, the factory owners, the import-export traders, almost all men. The profit concentrated at the top of the system, where women were rarely allowed to operate. So women were participating in the Christmas economy at every level, but they were benefiting unequally, and that inequality mapped onto class in ways that are still familiar today. The upper middle class woman bought ornaments as a luxury, a way to create memories and display taste. The lower middle class woman bought cheaper ornaments, or made her own from paper and tinsel, aspiring to the same ideal but on a fraction of the budget. The working class woman made the ornaments but couldn't afford to buy them, and the shop girl sold them while dreaming of the day she might be able to purchase them herself. 4 different women, 4 different relationships to the same Christmas tree. Here's what historian Judith Flanders discovered when she studied Victorian household budgets. A clerk's family earning £150 a year would typically spend about 15 shillings on Christmas in total. That included food, small gifts, and maybe 1 or 2 ornaments. A merchant's family earning £500 a year might spend £5 on Christmas. That's over 6 times more, but it represented the same proportion of their income, about 3%. But here's what's fascinating. Both families felt they were creating the same Christmas. Both put up trees, both gave gifts, both sang carols. The Victorian Christmas created an illusion of equality. Everyone could participate, everyone could have a tree, but the quality of that participation was determined entirely by class. Which brings us back to the women. Because women were navigating this inequality every single day, the middle-class woman stretched her budget to afford glass ornaments. The working woman stretched her wages to afford enough food for Christmas dinner. The shop girl stretched her feet standing for 13 hours, helping wealthier women buy things she couldn't afford. And all of them were told this was the season of peace and goodwill. Now, I don't want to paint this as purely negative. There was genuine opportunity here. Women in Lauscher were earning their own money. Shop girls were gaining commercial experience. Female shop owners were building businesses. Middle-class wives were exercising real economic power. This was the beginning of something. The Christmas industry was one of the first places where women's labour and women's consumption were both recognised as valuable. Not equal to men's, not fairly compensated, but recognised. By 1870, the Christmas industry employed over 50,000 women in Britain alone. Makers, sellers and managers. That's 50,000 women who had some economic independence, however limited. 50,000 women who were part of the commercial world in ways their grandmothers never were. And the industry kept growing. Because here's the secret. Women weren't just buying Christmas ornaments. They were buying the dream of the perfect Christmas. And that dream was endlessly expandable. Each year, the magazines would show new decorations, new ways to set the table, new gifts to give, and women, armed with their household budgets, would try to make it real. Not because they were foolish, because creating joy for their families was one of the few forms of power they were allowed to exercise. So yes, the Christmas industry exploited women. The wages were low, the hours were long, the profits were concentrated in male hands. But it also empowered women. It gave them economic roles. It acknowledged their purchasing power. It created the spaces where women's choices mattered. This is the complicated truth about Victorian Christmas. It was beautiful and it was exploitative, it was democratic and it was stratified. It gave women power and it limited that power, all at the same time. And the women who lived through it, they understood this complexity. They weren't passive victims or blind consumers. They were making the best choices they could within the constraints they faced. The glassblower taking pride in her craft, the shop owner building her business, the middle-class wife creating a magical Christmas on a tight budget. Every one of them was part of building the Christmas we inherited. The glittering, commercial, emotionally fraught, joy-creating, wallet-draining, memory-making phenomenon. And that's what makes this part of the story so important. Because when we talk about who invented modern Christmas, we usually name Queen Victoria and Prince Albert. But the truth is more complicated. They provided the image, the inspiration. But the millions of women who bought, sold and made Christmas, they built the reality. They turned a royal affectation into a global celebration. They created the market that made luxury Christmas possible. So the next time you hang an ornament on your tree, remember Elizabeth standing in that London shop in 1850 holding 3 weeks of savings in her hand. Remember the young woman in Lauscher blowing glass by firelight. Remember the shop girl on Oxford Street, her feet aching, helping the 10th customer of the hour. They're all there. In every ornament, every tradition, every Christmas we celebrate. Because luxury Christmas wasn't just invented by queens, it was purchased by middle-class wives, sold by female shopkeepers, and made by the hands of working women who would never enjoy the luxury they created. That's the real story. And it's just beginning to get more complicated. Because what happened when Christmas became so popular that it needed to be sent through the mail? when someone invented a way to send Christmas wishes to people far away. That's where we're headed next. To the surprising woman who helped invent the Christmas card and the even more surprising industry it created. An industry where women weren't just consumers or labourers, they were artists, and that changed everything. December 17th, 1843, London. A man named Henry Cole sat in his study staring at a pile of unanswered letters. Christmas was 8 days away. He had friends, colleagues, acquaintances, all expecting personalised greetings, and he simply did not have time to write them all. So he did something that seems obvious now, but was revolutionary then. He commissioned art. His friend, artist John Calcott Horsley, designed a card showing the Cole family raising a toast. Henry printed 1,000 copies, he signed them, he mailed them, he solved his problem, and accidentally invented the Christmas card. But here's what almost no one talks about. The Christmas card didn't just save Henry Cole time, it created an entirely new career for women, not as consumers, not as labourers, as artists. For the first time in Victorian England, women could make a living with their talent, and Christmas was the door that opened. Let me introduce you to Catherine Greenaway. You probably know her as Kate. She was born in 1846, 3 years after that first card. Her father was an engraver. Her mother was a seamstress who ran a dress shop in Islington. They lived above the shop. Kate grew up surrounded by fabric, fashion, and the precise art of her father's engravings. She was shy, she thought herself plain, but she could draw. At 12 years old, she enrolled in the Finsbury School of Art, then the South Kensington School of Art, then the Royal Female School of Art, then the Slade School of Fine Art, 4 different schools between 1858 and 1871, 13 years of training. Why so much training? Because Victorian society didn't believe women could be artists, they could be decorative, they could sketch flowers as a hobby, but serious art, that was for men. Kate needed credentials, mountains of credentials, just to be taken seriously. In 1871, she finished her training. She was 25 years old, she needed work, and she found it in the one place that would hire her, the Christmas card industry. Marcus Ward and the company, a Belfast printing firm, hired her on a freelance basis. They were one of the premier card makers in Britain. They needed artists who could create designs that would sell. They didn't care if those artists were women. They cared if those artists could draw. Kate could draw. Her first designs sold well. Her Valentine's cards sold 25,000 copies in weeks. The company said her special talent was in the direction of costume figures and dainty colours. High praise in Victorian England, where most people still believed women couldn't handle complex artistic work. But here's what's important. Kate wasn't making cards because she loved Christmas. She was making cards because it was the only professional art career available to women. The greeting card industry was so new, so commercial, so unrespectable, that it hadn't yet developed the gatekeeping that blocked women from other artistic fields. Oil painting. You needed Royal Academy training and the Academy barely admitted women. Sculpture, too physical for delicate female constitutions. Architecture, don't be ridiculous. But commercial art, Christmas cards, Valentine's Day designs, that was just decoration. That was ephemeral, that didn't count as real art, which meant women could do it and get paid for it. By 1870, the Christmas card market had exploded. Remember, Henry Cole's first card in 1843 sold 1,000 copies at 1 shilling each. It was expensive, it was elite. It didn't catch on immediately. But then 2 things happened. The penny post in 1840 made sending mail affordable, and chromolithography in the 1860s made colour printing cheap. Suddenly, cards that used to cost a shilling could be printed for pennies, and everyone wanted them. In 1870, the Royal Mail reduced postage to a halfpenny per ounce. Do you know what happened? A newspaper in 1871 complained that Christmas cards were delaying business letters. The volume was overwhelming the postal system. By 1873, newspapers were printing announcements from people saying, "We will not be sending cards this year, but wish all our friends a Merry Christmas." They had to announce it publicly because everyone expected cards. In 1879, the post office issued its first official plea. Post early for Christmas, because millions of cards were flooding the system. And who was designing all these cards? Increasingly women. Kate Greenaway wasn't alone. There was Linnie Watts, who specialised in poignant paintings of children. Helen Allingham, who illustrated Thomas Hardy's work and became one of the few women artists given solo exhibitions in the 1880s and 1890s. Rebecca Coleman, a decorative artist who worked with her brother William for De La Rue Company. These women were professionals. They negotiated contracts, they understood printing techniques, they knew their market. They were business people who happened to be artists, or artists who happened to be business people. Take Kate's career trajectory. In 1879, she published Under the Window, a collection of verses about children. It was illustrated with her distinctive style. Children in imaginary 18th century costumes, soft colours, whimsical scenes. It was an instant bestseller. Within years, Kate Greenaway's style became a phenomenon. Greenaway-isme, one French commentator called it. Liberty of London created an entire children's clothing line based on her drawings. Wealthy mothers dressed their daughters in Kate Greenaway pantaloons and bonnets. An entire aesthetic movement bore her name, from Christmas cards to cultural icon. That was the trajectory available to women artists in this new industry. But let's be realistic about the numbers. Kate Greenaway became famous. Most women artists in the card industry did not. For every Kate who achieved recognition, there were hundreds of anonymous women designers whose names never appeared on their work. Marcus Ward and the company employed dozens of female artists. We know some names. Most are lost. They designed cards that sold in the thousands, the tens of thousands. Cards that made publishers wealthy. But the artists themselves? They were paid by the piece, like the ornament makers in Lauscher. A design might sell for 2 guineas, that's £2 and 2 shillings. If that design was then printed and sold 5,000 times, the publisher made perhaps £150 in profit. The artist got her 2 guineas. Once. No royalties, no percentages, just a flat fee. Was it fair? No. Was it better than most options available to Victorian women? Absolutely. Think about Kate's mother. A seamstress running a small shop. She worked 12 to 14 hours a day, her fingers constantly moving, her eyes straining in dim light. Her income was uncertain, dependent on customers, subject to fashion changes. Kate, by comparison, worked from her studio. She set her own hours. She chose which commissions to accept. By 1880, she was earning enough to live comfortably, support herself entirely through her art. That was revolutionary. A woman supporting herself through creative work. Not teaching, not governess work, not marrying for financial security, creating art and earning a living from it. The Christmas card industry made this possible because it existed in a strange space, commercial enough that traditional art institutions ignored it, profitable enough that publishers would hire anyone with talent, new enough that it hadn't yet developed the exclusionary practices that kept women out of other professions, and the market kept growing. By 1880, publishers were running competitions for card designs. Hildesheimer and Faulkner held a design contest in 1881 offering 500 guineas in prizes. That's over £500 for card designs. 500 guineas would support a middle-class family for 2 years. The prize was split among multiple winners, but even a portion of it was substantial income. And women competed. Women won. Raphael Tuck and Sons launched their Royal Academy series in the 1880s, commissioning famous artists to design cards. They understood something crucial. If you wanted your cards to sell, you hired the best artists available. Gender was irrelevant. Talent was everything. This was capitalism accidentally creating opportunity. Publishers didn't care about empowering women, they cared about profit. But profit required talent, and women had talent, so women got hired. By 1885, the industry employed thousands of women. Artists, yes, but also hand colourers, lithographers, envelope makers, card folders. The Christmas card business was one of the largest employers of female artistic labour in Britain. Louis Prang, an American printer, was producing 5 million Christmas cards per year by the 1880s. He employed hundreds of women in stable positions. His factories were noted for offering suitable employment, especially for women, a real rarity of the times. Think about what that means. Hundreds of women earning steady wages, not seasonal labour, not temporary positions, full-time employment in artistic and technical work. Was it perfect? No. The women in Prang's factories earned less than men in equivalent positions. They had limited advancement opportunities. They worked long hours, especially during the Christmas season. But they were doing skilled work. They were using their training. They were in the commercial art world learning printing techniques, understanding colour theory, developing professional skills. Some of them would go on to other careers. Some would become independent designers. Some would remain factory workers their entire lives. But all of them were participating in professional artistic production in a way that would have been impossible 20 years earlier. Now, let's talk about what was actually on these cards, because the images themselves tell us something important about women's role in creating Christmas. Kate Greenaway's cards showed children playing, families gathering, pastoral scenes of English countryside. Linnie Watts painted children with such emotional depth that her cards could make people cry. Harry Payne illustrated soldiers, reminding families of loved ones serving far away. But notice something. The military cards were designed by a man. The children, the domestic scenes, the emotional content, almost always women artists. Victorian publishers understood their market. Women bought most of the Christmas cards. Women decided which cards to send to which people. So publishers hired women artists to create designs that would appeal to women consumers. This created a fascinating loop. Women designing for women creating the visual language of Victorian Christmas for other women to purchase and send. And what was that visual language? It was softer than what male artists typically produced. It emphasized relationships over achievements, children over heroes, domestic warmth over public glory, the inside over the outside. In other words, it was taking the private sphere where women were confined and making it beautiful, making it valuable, making it art. Kate Greenaway's children weren't preparing for war or conquest. They were playing, dreaming, existing in moments of simple joy. This was radical because it said these moments mattered. The everyday life of children, of families, of home was worthy of artistic attention, and millions of people agreed. They bought the cards, they saved them. Victorian women kept albums of Christmas cards, arranging them artfully, displaying them like galleries in their homes. These weren't just greetings, they were art collections. The Victoria and Albert Museum now holds over 30,000 Christmas cards from the Victorian era. 30,000 examples of commercial art, much of it created by women, considered important enough to preserve. That's a legacy. But let's not romanticize this too much. The Christmas card industry also exploited women's labour. Anonymous designers paid flat fees, factory workers earning minimal wages, hand colourers going blind from close work in dim light. Kate Greenaway's success was the exception, not the rule. For every woman artist who achieved recognition, there were hundreds who remained invisible. Their designs were printed, their work was sold, their talent made publishers wealthy. But their names? Lost to history. This is the pattern we keep seeing in Victorian Christmas. Women participating at every level. Women exercising creativity and skill. Women building an industry. But the profits, the recognition, the power, still mostly flowing to men. Male publishers owned the companies. Male printers ran the factories. Male distributors controlled the supply chains. Women created much of the content, but men controlled the industry. Still, something real had changed. The Christmas card created a space where women's artistic talent was recognized as commercially valuable, where women could earn money from creative work, where the things women knew how to depict, the domestic, the emotional, the relational, were suddenly marketable. This mattered because once you prove that women's creativity has commercial value, you can't unprove it. Once you demonstrate that women can design, can manage color and composition, can understand markets and audiences, you've opened a door that's very hard to close. By 1890, there were women running their own card design studios, women negotiating directly with publishers, women training other women in artistic technique. The industry Kate Greenaway had entered as an uncertain freelancer had become a legitimate career path. Not an easy path, not an equal path, but a path that existed. And every Christmas card sent, every design commissioned, every woman artist paid for her work was proof that women's contributions to Christmas were valuable. Not just as purchasers, not just as labourers, as creators. This is why the Christmas card matters in our story. It was the first Christmas industry where women's intellectual and creative labour was recognised and compensated, where women weren't just making things with their hands, but creating with their minds and being paid for it. The glass blower in Lauscher created beauty but followed patterns. The shop girl sold items but didn't design them. The middle-class housewife chose decorations but didn't make them. But the card designer, she imagined, she created. She put her vision onto paper, and that vision was reproduced thousands of times, sent to thousands of homes, kept in thousands of albums. That's authorship, that's artistic agency, that's women leaving their mark on Victorian culture in a way that would last. And Christmas made it possible. Because Christmas was commercial enough to need mass production, sentimental enough to value emotional content, and new enough that traditional barriers hadn't yet fully formed. So when you send a Christmas card this year, remember you're participating in a tradition that almost by accident created one of the first professional opportunities for women artists. A tradition that said women's creative vision had value. A tradition that thousands of Victorian women used to build careers, support themselves and leave their mark on history. Kate Greenaway died in 1901. She was 55 years old. She had spent 30 years creating art that millions of people loved. She had influenced fashion, design, and the entire visual aesthetic of childhood in Victorian England. She started by designing Christmas cards because it was the only professional art career available to her. She ended as one of the most recognised artists of her generation. That's what the Christmas card made possible. Not for every woman, not equally, but possible nonetheless. And that possibility was about to expand even further, because Christmas wasn't just creating new industries, it was creating new social expectations, new traditions, new ways for women to exercise influence and demonstrate expertise. The next part of our story involves dinner tables, cookbooks, and the woman who convinced Victorian England that Christmas dinner was an art form. Her name was Isabella Beeton, and she turned food into war. Picture this. December the 25th, 1862. A middle-class woman in London is standing in her kitchen, holding a book. It weighs over 3 pounds. It's over 1,000 pages long, and it's open to page 412. She's reading about goose. The book tells her exactly how long to roast it, exactly what temperature, exactly which herbs to use in the stuffing, exactly how to present it so that when her husband carves it at the table, it looks like art. This book, she believes, is her Bible, her army field manual, her proof that she is good at the most important job a woman can have, running a household. The book is called Beeton's Book of Household Management, and it sold 60,000 copies in its first year, nearly 2 million by 1868. The woman who wrote it was 21 years old when she started. Her name was Isabella Beeton, and she did something remarkable. She took the chaotic, intimidating, class-specific world of Victorian Christmas dinner and turned it into a system that any middle-class woman could master. But here's what's really interesting. Isabella Beeton didn't actually know how to cook. Let me explain what I mean by that. Isabella Mary Mason was born in 1836. Her mother died when she was young. Her stepmother ran a household with multiple servants. Isabella grew up watching other people cook. She grew up eating well-prepared food, but she didn't grow up in the kitchen. In 1856, at 20 years old, Isabella married Samuel Beeton, a publisher. He was launching the English Woman's Domestic Magazine, aimed at middle-class wives who were trying to navigate the new Victorian world of household management. Samuel asked Isabella to contribute. She started writing a monthly column on household topics: cooking, cleaning, managing servants, the proper way to run a middle-class home, and women devoured it. Why? Because for the first time someone was telling them exactly what to do. Not vaguely, not assuming they already knew, but step by step with measurements and timing and lists of ingredients placed right at the beginning of each recipe. This was revolutionary. Previous cookbooks assumed knowledge. They'd say things like take flour without specifying how much. Cook until done without giving a time. Season appropriately without listing which spices. Isabella Beeton changed that. She was the first cookbook author to place ingredients at the start of each recipe, the first to specify cooking times, the first to organize information in a way that assumed the reader knew nothing and needed to learn everything. Because she was that reader, she was learning as she went. Her half-sister Lucy later recalled watching Isabella test recipes in their kitchen at Pinner. Some worked, some didn't. Once Isabella came out of the kitchen saying, "This won't do at all," and handed Lucy a cake that had turned out like a biscuit. But that's exactly what made her effective. She wasn't writing from expertise, she was writing from the experience of figuring things out. And middle-class Victorian women recognized themselves in that struggle. Here's the context you need to understand. In 1861, when Isabella's book was published, England was experiencing massive social change. The Industrial Revolution had created a new middle class. These families had enough money to aspire to gentility, but not enough to have been raised in it. The men were clerks, accountants, shopkeepers, small business owners. Their incomes ranged from £150 to £500 a year, enough for a small house, maybe one or two servants, but nowhere near the wealth of the upper classes. And the women? They were trying to figure out how to perform middle-class femininity with no instruction manual. Their mothers might have been working class, unable to teach them the elaborate rituals of Victorian household management. Or they might have been upper class and never learned because servants did everything. Either way, these women were lost, and Christmas dinner was the annual test of whether they could perform their role properly. Let me show you what Isabella told them about Christmas dinner, because this is where her influence gets really interesting. In her book, she wrote, "A Christmas dinner with the middle classes of this empire would scarcely be a Christmas dinner without its turkey, and we can hardly imagine an object of greater envy than is presented by a respected portly pater, familias carving, at the season devoted to good cheer and genial charity, his own fat turkey, and carving it well." Notice what she's doing here. She's not just giving instructions, she's defining what Christmas dinner should be for middle-class families. Turkey, not goose turkey, which was more expensive, more prestigious, more clearly middle-class. Working-class families ate goose. They saved up all year through goose clubs, paying sixpence from their weekly wages for months to afford a Christmas bird. Many didn't have ovens, so they'd take their goose to the local bakery to be roasted. Upper-class families ate multiple meats: roast beef, venison, game pies, sometimes swan. Queen Victoria herself ate roast swan for Christmas. But middle class, Isabella said turkey, and she gave them exact instructions. Her recipe for roast turkey specified 50 large chestnuts for the stuffing, exactly 1 pound of veal, exactly half a pound of salt pork, half a teaspoonful of pepper, 2 tablespoonfuls of salt, 1 cupful of stock, every measurement precise, nothing left to chance. She told them the turkey should be larded. She told them how to truss it. She told them to serve it with chestnut sauce made from the remaining chestnuts. She even told them what vegetables to serve alongside: potatoes, Brussels sprouts, root vegetables. She was creating the blueprint for what we still think of as Christmas dinner, and she was giving middle-class women the tools to execute it perfectly, proving their competence as household managers. But here's what's fascinating. Most of her recipes weren't original. Modern historians call it plagiarism. Isabella copied liberally from other cookbooks, particularly Eliza Acton's Modern Cookery for Private Families from 1845. Sometimes she copied almost word for word. Her biographer, Catherine Hughes, says she was lifting and brazenly copying from others. The famous food writer Elizabeth David later dismissed Isabella as a plagiarist and said, "I wonder if I would have ever learned to cook at all if I'd been given a routine Mrs. Beeton to learn from." But here's the thing. Isabella wasn't claiming to have invented these recipes. She was organizing them, systematizing them, making them accessible. And in the process, she was doing something remarkable. She was telling middle-class women that household management wasn't just women's work. It was skilled work. Important work. Work that required knowledge, organization, and expertise. Her book opened with this statement: "The mistress is the first and last, the alpha and omega in the government of her establishment. It is by her conduct that its whole internal policy is regulated." She compared the mistress of the house to a commander of an army. She said running a household required the same strategic thinking, the same attention to detail, the same executive capability. This was radical. Because Victorian society told women they were too emotional, too delicate, too intellectually limited to manage anything important. They couldn't vote. They couldn't own property if married. They couldn't pursue most professions. But Isabella was saying, your domain is your household, and that domain requires the highest level of capability. You are not frivolous, you are not merely decorative, you are running a complex operation that requires skill and intelligence. And Christmas dinner was the showcase for that skill. Think about what a Victorian middle-class Christmas dinner actually involved. Isabella's suggested menu for 8 people included roasted goose, roasted turkey, sirloin of beef, plum pudding, Brussels sprouts, mashed potatoes, forcemeat stuffing, chestnut stuffing, mang, oyster soup, mince pies. That's not a meal, that's a military campaign. The goose alone required hours of preparation. The turkey needed to be stuffed, trussed, and roasted at precise timing. The beef had to be perfectly done. The plum pudding had to be made weeks in advance and boiled for hours in a large copper pot, usually in the laundry room because most kitchen pots weren't big enough. Coordinating all of this to be ready at the same time, at the right temperature, presented correctly while managing whatever servants you had and maintaining a gracious demeanour, that required serious competence. And Isabella gave women the framework to do it. Her book included timetables, shopping lists, budgets. She told you exactly what to buy and where to buy it. She told you how much everything should cost. She told you which servants should do which tasks. She treated Christmas dinner like the complex logistical operation it was, and in doing so she validated the work that women were doing. This mattered enormously, because the only power most Victorian women had was domestic power. They couldn't control their finances. They couldn't control their legal status. They couldn't control much of anything outside their homes. But inside their homes, if they followed Isabella's instructions, they could be experts, authorities, commanders. A successful Christmas dinner meant your husband was impressed. Your children were happy. Your relatives were envious. Your social standing was confirmed. You had performed your role perfectly and everyone knew it. Isabella's book sold well because it gave women the script for that performance. And it told them that the performance mattered, that their work had value, that they were skilled professionals managing complex operations. Now let's be honest about the limitations here. This was power within very narrow constraints. Isabella's book was aimed at middle-class women who could afford at least one servant. If you were working class, most of this was irrelevant. You couldn't afford a turkey that cost a week's wages. You couldn't spend days preparing pudding. You were lucky if you could afford a goose and a few vegetables. And even for middle-class women, this was still domestic power. It didn't translate into political power, economic power, or social power outside the home. A woman could run a flawless Christmas dinner and still have no legal rights, no financial autonomy, no voice in public life. But here's what's interesting. By validating domestic expertise, Isabella was creating a foundation. She was saying women were capable of complex management, strategic thinking, executive decision-making, just in the home rather than in business or government. That argument, once established, became harder to contain. If women could successfully manage households, command servants, budget finances, plan elaborate events, what exactly prevented them from doing similar work in other spheres? Isabella herself never made that argument explicitly. She died too young. On February 6, 1865, less than 4 years after her book was published, Isabella died from puerperal fever. She'd contracted it during the birth of her 4th child. She was 28 years old. Think about that. She wrote this book between the ages of 21 and 25. She revolutionized how an entire class of women thought about household management. She sold nearly 2 million copies. She influenced generations of cooks and homemakers, and she died at 28, having spent her entire adult life either pregnant or recovering from childbirth while simultaneously producing over 1,000 pages of household instruction. The tragedy is palpable, but so is the legacy. After her death, her husband Samuel initially suppressed the news so he could keep publishing under her name. Later publishers removed the obituary notice from subsequent editions, letting readers imagine that some experienced matriarch was behind these instructions, rather than a young woman who'd been figuring it out as she went. But women kept buying the book, they kept using it. It remained in print continuously. By 1914, it was probably the most often consulted cookbook in Britain. It's still in print today. Why? Because Isabella had tapped into something essential. The need for validation, the need for instruction, the need to believe that the work you're doing matters and you're capable of doing it well. Every middle-class woman who successfully executed a Christmas dinner using Isabella's instructions proved something to herself. She proved she was competent. She proved she belonged in the middle class. She proved she could perform the role Victorian society assigned her. Was it limiting? Yes. Was it the only role women should have been allowed? Absolutely not. But within that constrained space, Isabella gave women tools for mastery. And mastery, even in a limited domain, builds confidence and capability. The women who learned to manage Christmas dinner using Isabella's methods learned they could master complex tasks. They learned they could organize resources. They learned they could plan ahead and execute precisely. They learned they had skills. And some of those women, or their daughters, would eventually ask why those skills couldn't be applied elsewhere. Why a woman capable of commanding a household couldn't vote. Why a woman capable of budgeting for 8 people couldn't manage business finances. Why a woman capable of navigating complex social protocols couldn't participate in public life. Isabella didn't live to see any of that, but she planted seeds, and every Christmas dinner that followed, every turkey perfectly roasted, every plum pudding successfully flamed, every table beautifully set, was evidence that women were capable of more than Victorian society wanted to admit. So when we talk about who created luxury Christmas, we can't leave out Isabella Beeton. She didn't invent the turkey dinner. She didn't create the plum pudding. But she systematized them. She democratized them. She made them teachable. She took food, that most basic necessity, and turned it into proof of female competence. She took Christmas dinner, that annual family gathering, and made it a stage where women could demonstrate expertise. Was it constraining? Yes. Was it empowering within those constraints? Absolutely. And the Victorian women who stood in their kitchens, holding that £3 book, reading instructions for roasting goose? They were doing more than cooking. They were claiming authority. They were exercising the only power Victorian society allowed them. But they were exercising it, and that mattered. The question we're left with is, what happens when Christmas becomes so successful that it needs even more industries, more products, more ways to demonstrate your participation in this luxury celebration? Because Christmas wasn't done expanding, it wasn't done creating opportunities and constraints for women. Next, we're going to look at something that sounds simple but became incredibly complicated. Christmas fashion. The question of what to wear became tangled up with mourning custom, with Queen Victoria's personal grief, and with an entire industry that employed thousands of women while simultaneously restricting them. December 14th, 1861. Prince Albert, husband of Queen Victoria, dies of typhoid fever at Windsor Castle. He is 42 years old. They have been married for 21 years. They have 9 children. Victoria is devastated. She writes to her daughter, "How I, who leant on him for all and everything, without whom I did nothing, moved not a finger, arranged not a print or photograph, didn't put on a gown or bonnet if he didn't approve it shall go on, to live, to move, to help myself in difficult moments." And then she makes a decision that will reshape an entire industry. She will wear black, not just for the customary year or two, but for the rest of her life. 40 years. She wore mourning for 40 years until her death in 1901. And because she did, millions of women across Britain and America did the same. Not for 40 years necessarily, but they followed the rules she reinforced. The elaborate, expensive, socially mandatory rules of Victorian mourning. And those rules? They created one of the most profitable industries of the 19th century, an industry that employed thousands of women while simultaneously trapping them in layers of black fabric, social restriction, and impossible etiquette. But here's what almost no one talks about. Victorian mourning didn't just affect funerals, it affected Christmas dramatically. Because if you were in mourning, you couldn't celebrate Christmas. No parties, no gatherings, no joy. You were expected to stay home, wear black, and demonstrate your grief publicly for a prescribed period of time. Which meant that the luxury Christmas we've been tracking, this elaborate celebration that women had been building and buying and creating, for thousands of families every year it simply vanished. Let me show you how this worked. The rules for mourning were intricate. They varied by relationship and gender. If your husband died, you were expected to mourn for 2 years minimum. If your parent died, 1 year. Sibling, 6 months. More distant relative, 3 months minimum. And these weren't suggestions, these were social requirements. If you appeared in public wearing the wrong shade of grey 6 months after your husband's death when you should still be in full black, people noticed. They judged. They gossiped. Women's magazines published detailed guides. The Queen and Castle's household management told you exactly what to wear and when. They specified fabrics. Dull black Parramatta silk for deep mourning, then bombazine, then gradually lighter materials as time passed. They told you about crepe, this horrible scratchy silk fabric with a crimped texture that could only be worn for mourning. You couldn't combine it with velvet or lace or embroidery. It announced to everyone that you were in grief, and you were supposed to cover yourself in it. Widows wore crepe veils that covered their entire face for the first year. Black crepe over black dress, over black petticoat, over black stockings, layers and layers of black. Even your jewellery was regulated. Only jet, that hard black coal-like material. Sometimes woven with hair from the deceased. Nothing decorative. Nothing that suggested you were capable of joy. Men had it easier. They wore their usual dark suits with black hatbands, black gloves, black armbands. They could go about their business. They could attend social events. Their mourning was symbolic but not confining. But women's entire lives stopped. No social gatherings, no visits except to immediate family, no theatre, no concerts, no parties, and absolutely, definitively, Christmas celebrations. Can you imagine? Your mother dies in October. That means no Christmas that year. No tree, no dinner party, no gifts exchanged with friends. Your family sits in your darkened parlour wearing black, demonstrating proper grief while the rest of the world celebrates. This wasn't rare. In an era when death rates were high, when disease could strike suddenly, when childbirth killed women regularly, mourning was a constant presence in Victorian life. And because people died year-round, there were always families in mourning during Christmas. Always women who had to forgo the elaborate dinners they'd mastered. Always children who watched other families celebrate while their own household remained dark and silent. This is the side of Victorian Christmas no one talks about. The families excluded from the luxury. The women whose competence in household management couldn't be displayed because social rules forbade celebration. But here's where it gets interesting. Queen Victoria herself didn't celebrate Christmas after Albert's death. For 40 years, she either ignored the holiday entirely or observed it with such minimal acknowledgement that it barely qualified as celebration. She kept Albert's rooms exactly as he'd left them. His shaving water was brought fresh every morning as if he might still use it. His photograph was everywhere. She commissioned statues of him. She built monuments to him. And she wore black. Always black. Even in her 80s, even 30 years after his death, she wore black mourning dress with maybe small touches of white for half mourning. Never colour, never decoration. Never the slightest suggestion that her grief had ended. This was the woman who, with Albert, had popularised the Christmas tree. The woman whose 1848 illustration had launched the entire Christmas industry, and now she was absent from it. The irony is stunning. Victoria helped create luxury Christmas. Then her grief removed her from participating in it, and her example ensured thousands of other women would be similarly removed. But while Victoria's grief shut her away from Christmas, it created enormous business opportunities for other women, because someone had to provide all those mourning clothes, someone had to sew them, fit them, sell them. Enter the mourning warehouses. In 1841, the same decade Victoria popularised Christmas trees, a man named William Chickhall Jay opened Jay's London General Mourning Warehouse on Regent Street. It was revolutionary. A department store entirely dedicated to death. You could walk into Jay's and purchase everything you needed for mourning. Black dresses in every size and style, black veils, black gloves, black stockings, black handkerchiefs, jet jewellery, black stationery with black bordered envelopes, black fabric to drape your home, even coffins, hearses and horses to draw them. Everything in one place, available immediately. Because there was a superstition, it was unlucky to keep mourning clothes in your house after mourning ended. Which meant when the next death occurred you needed new clothes. Urgently. Jay's capitalised on this brilliantly. They offered same-day service, they employed lady fitters who would come to your home with patterns and fabric samples if you couldn't leave the house. They had black coaches with black-clad coachmen ready to dispatch at a moment's notice. By 1892, they'd installed a telephone, one of the first businesses in London to do so. The number was London 3557. Not that many people had phones to call them, but it was advertising. It was prestige. It said, "We are modern, we are efficient, we understand you need us quickly." And they commissioned a book. A History of Mourning by Richard Davey. It covered mourning practices from ancient Egypt to Victorian England. It educated readers about the history of grief customs, and it concluded conveniently that Jay's was a marked unique both for the quality and nature of its attributes. This was marketing genius. Wrap your business in historical legitimacy. Make people feel that buying from you is participating in ancient tradition. Make the rules seem natural, inevitable, timeless rather than commercially motivated. because that's what they were, commercially motivated. The more complicated the mourning rules, the more items people needed to purchase. The more stages of mourning, the more wardrobe changes required. Full mourning to second mourning to half mourning, each requiring different fabrics, different accessories. And the rule about not keeping mourning clothes, that guaranteed repeat customers. Your mother dies this year, you buy mourning clothes. Your aunt dies next year, you buy them again. You can't reuse them. That would be unlucky. It was a self-perpetuating system. Social pressure enforced the rules. Fear of judgment compelled compliance. Superstition prevented economizing. And businesses like Jay's profited enormously. After Albert's death in 1861, Jay's experienced unprecedented sales. The entire nation was in mourning. Middle-class families, desperate to demonstrate their loyalty to the Queen and their own respectability, purchased mourning clothes even if they had no personal connection to the royal family. By 1865, multiple mourning warehouses occupied Regent Street, competing for customers. Peter Robinson's Family and General Mourning Warehouse, affectionately called Black Peter's by customers. Pugh's Mourning Warehouse, Nicholson Brothers. The street became known for its black-clad displays. And who worked in these warehouses? Primarily women. Female seamstresses sewed the garments. Female fitters travelled to homes with patterns and measurements. Female shop assistants helped customers select appropriate items for their stage of mourning. Female managers supervised departments. The mourning industry was one of the largest employers of women in Victorian England. Thousands of working-class women earned wages making, selling and fitting mourning clothes for middle and upper-class women. But the class dynamic here is crucial. The women who made mourning clothes often couldn't afford elaborate mourning themselves. If their mother died, they might dye an existing dress black, they might wear a black armband. But full mourning wardrobe with crepe veils and jet jewellery, that was middle class and above. So you had working class women spending 12-hour days creating mourning clothes they'd never wear, for women who could afford to stop their lives and demonstrate grief properly. And the middle-class women buying those clothes, they were trapped in a different way. They could afford the proper wardrobe, but affording it meant actually wearing it, following the rules, withdrawing from society, cancelling Christmas. Let me give you specific numbers. A widow's complete mourning wardrobe for the first year cost approximately £15 to £20. That's several months' income for a working-class family. For a middle-class clerk earning £200 annually, it was nearly 10% of his yearly salary, and that was just the first year. The second year required new clothes in slightly different fabrics. Half mourning required an entire wardrobe of grey, mauve and white garments. An 1881 article in Sylvia's Home Journal listed what a new widow needed to purchase: a best dress covered in crepe, 12 collars and cuffs, 12 handkerchiefs with black borders, 4 pairs of black hose. Multiply that by however many family members needed mourning clothes, and you see the financial burden. A mother dies, the entire family must dress appropriately. Father, mother's children, even servants were expected to wear mourning badges. This created genuine hardship for some families. They couldn't afford proper mourning, but they couldn't afford not to purchase it either. The social cost of failing to mourn correctly could affect your family's reputation, your business relationships, your children's marriage prospects. So families borrowed money, went into debt, purchased on credit from mourning warehouses that offered payment plans, knowing they had customers trapped between social obligation and financial limitation. And all of this was wrapped in the language of respect, love, proper feeling. If you didn't mourn correctly, it meant you didn't truly grieve. It meant you were callous, unfeeling, socially inferior. The warehouses encouraged this. They published etiquette guides explaining proper mourning, not because they cared about propriety, but because complicated rules meant more. Sills. Jay's guide specified different mourning requirements for different relationships: widow 2 years, parent 1 year, sibling 6 months, aunt or uncle 3 months, second cousin 6 weeks. Each period required specific clothes. Each had stages within stages. The more detailed the rules, the more purchases necessary. And women internalized these rules. They believed in them. Or at least they believed in the social consequences of not following them. Because here's the thing, the alternative to following mourning rules wasn't freedom. It was judgment, gossip, social exclusion. If you didn't mourn properly, people questioned your character, your feelings, your respectability. So women complied. They spent money they sometimes didn't have on clothes that restricted their movement and their lives. They withdrew from society, from work, from joy. They demonstrated grief publicly, elaborately, expensively, and they skipped Christmas. Year after year, thousands of Victorian families sat in dark parlours during December, wearing black, forbidden from celebrating the holiday that was supposedly becoming universal. This is what makes Victorian Christmas so complicated. It was becoming more commercial, more elaborate, more expected, but it was also becoming more exclusive. The families who could afford it celebrated lavishly. The families in mourning were excluded entirely, and the women making the Christmas goods and mourning clothes worked through both, celebrating neither. The mourning industry reached its peak in the 1880s and 1890s. Courtaulds, a British fabric manufacturer, made a fortune selling nothing but black crepe. By the end of the century, they were one of the wealthiest textile companies in England, built entirely on grief. Whitby, a small fishing village in Yorkshire, became prosperous because it was the primary source of quality jet. Every conceivable mourning accessory was made there. Beading for bodices, hair combs, brooches, clasps for hats and bonnets. An entire economy built on death, employing thousands, restricting millions. But something interesting started happening in the 1890s. People began questioning the rules. The expense was crushing for many families. The social restriction felt increasingly absurd, and as Victoria aged into her 70s and 80s, still wearing black 30 years after Albert's death, her grief started seeming less admirable and more obsessive. By the time Victoria died in 1901, attitudes were shifting. The elaborate mourning industry began declining. World War I effectively killed it. When millions of soldiers died, when every family had losses, elaborate individual mourning became impossible. The nation was in collective grief, which made individual displays seem self-indulgent. But for 40 years, from 1861 to 1901, Victorian mourning shaped women's lives as much as Christmas did. More actually, because mourning was mandatory while Christmas was optional. And the women caught in this system? They navigated it as best they could. Working-class women sewed mourning clothes to support their families. Middle-class women bought and wore them to maintain their social standing. Upper-class women like Victoria used them to express genuine grief but also to demonstrate propriety. All of them were operating within constraints. All of them were doing what the system demanded. And the system, as always, was designed to profit someone. Usually not the women participating in it. This is important to understand as we think about Victorian Christmas. Yes, it created opportunities for women as consumers, labourers and artists, but it also created obligations, restrictions and exclusions. The same society that told women they were commanders of their households also told them they couldn't celebrate Christmas if they were in mourning. The same society that validated women's domestic expertise also required them to wear uncomfortable black crepe for years after a death. Power and constraint, opportunity and restriction always intertwined, never separate. And Christmas itself? It continued growing. The families not in mourning celebrated more elaborately each year. New traditions emerged. New industries developed. New ways to demonstrate your participation in this increasingly essential holiday. But running through all of it was this underlying reality. Luxury Christmas was built by women, purchased by women, largely created by women's labour and choices. But it was also built for women who could afford it and weren't prevented from celebrating it by death, by mourning rules, by social obligation. The next chapter of our story looks at the women who managed to find freedom within the Christmas industry despite all these restrictions. The female entrepreneurs who saw business opportunities in the holiday. The women who turned Christmas from something they participated in as consumers into something they controlled as business owners. Because while the mourning industry was trapping women in black crepe, another group of women was building retail empires, opening shops, and finding ways to exercise economic power that extended beyond their households. 1860 New York City. A young woman walks into a dry goods store on the corner of 14th Street and 6th Avenue. She's 20 years old. She's partially blind in one eye from an accident. She left her teaching job in Virginia when the Civil War started. She needs work. The store owner's name is Roland Macy. He listens to her story. They discover they're both from Nantucket. They share Yankee heritage, island memories, a pragmatic view of business. He hires her as a cash clerk. Her name is Margaret Getchell, and she's about to become the first female retail executive in American history. But here's what makes Margaret's story important for us. She didn't just work in retail, she created it. She invented the department store as we know it. She turned Christmas shopping from necessity into experience, and she did it all while navigating a world that insisted women couldn't run businesses. 6 years after being hired, Margaret was promoted to superintendent of Macy's. She managed 200 employees. She oversaw a store generating $1 million in annual sales. She was, in every practical sense, second in command of the entire operation. Her motto, be everywhere, do everything, and never forget to astonish the customer. And astonish them she did. Margaret looked at Roland Macy's little red star tattoo, the one he'd gotten during his whaling days, and said, "Make that your logo, put it on everything. Price tags, letterhead, advertisements, create a brand." She suggested adding toys and children's books. They became best-selling departments. She noticed soda fountains becoming popular in Europe. She told Macy to install one but put it at the back of the store, so customers had to walk past all the merchandise to reach it. Sales exploded. She created elaborate window displays. She understood something revolutionary. Shopping wasn't just about buying things. It was about experience, entertainment, aspiration. You had to astonish people. And Christmas was the perfect opportunity for astonishment. Under Margaret's leadership, Macy's became a Christmas destination. Not just a place to purchase items, but a place to feel the magic of the season. To see what was new, what was possible, what you could create in your own home if you had the right products and the right inspiration. This is a fundamentally different approach to retail, and it came from a woman. But here's the twist in Margaret's story. In 1869, she married Abel LaForge, a lace buyer at the store. 2 years later, when LaForge was promoted to partner, Margaret was asked to give up her salary. Not her position, not her work, just her compensation. Because married women, especially wives of partners, weren't supposed to need wages, her husband would support her. So she continued managing the store, overseeing hundreds of employees, creating the strategies that tripled Macy's size, but she did it unpaid. She died in 1880 at age 38, from heart failure and ovarian inflammation. Too young, too soon, after giving Macy's nearly 20 years of brilliance that went largely uncompensated after her marriage. This is the reality of female entrepreneurship in Victorian England and America. Real power, real contribution, real genius, but always constrained, always conditional, always at risk of being taken away. And yet, despite these constraints, women built businesses, lots of them. Here's a statistic that will surprise you. In Victorian Britain, between 1851 and 1911, women owned 27 to 30% of all businesses, Nearly 1/3. That's higher than today. In 2017, only 21% of British businesses were female-led. Victorian women were more likely to own businesses than modern women. How is this possible? How could Victorian women, with fewer legal rights, less access to capital, active discrimination from banks and trade guilds, own more businesses than contemporary women? The answer is both inspiring and depressing. They owned businesses because they had to, because other options were worse. Because entrepreneurship, despite its challenges, offered more control than wage labour. Let me explain the mechanics. Victorian law was brutal to married women. Until the Married Women's Property Acts of 1870 and 1882, a married woman couldn't own property. Everything belonged to her husband, including any wages she earned. This made wage labour particularly unappealing for married women. Why work for someone else when your husband legally controlled your earnings? But if you ran your own business, even though your husband technically owned it, you could at least control the day-to-day operations. So married women became shopkeepers, dressmakers, laundresses, lodging house operators. They ran businesses from their homes, setting their own hours, managing their own work. Over 70% of female business owners work from home. Only 7% of female wage workers could say the same. This flexibility mattered enormously if you had children. And here's something fascinating. Having children actually increased women's likelihood of running a business. The more children under 5, the higher the entrepreneurship rate. Because you couldn't work factory hours with small children. You couldn't leave home for 12 hours daily. But you could run a business from your kitchen, taking orders between feeding babies, sewing dresses while children played nearby. Was it ideal? No. Was it freedom? Not exactly. But it was autonomy within constraint. It was power within limitation. And some women used that limited power to build substantial enterprises. Eliza Tinsley, widowed in 1851 with 6 children, took over her husband's nail manufacturing trade. Within 15 years, she'd transformed it into the Eliza Tinsley Company, employing 4,000 workers. That company still exists today, nearly 200 years later. 4,000 employees under a woman's management in 1866. Most female entrepreneurs operated on much smaller scales, of course. The typical female-owned business had no employees beyond the owner. Maybe 1 or 2 family members helped. These were survivalist enterprises, not growth ventures. But they were businesses. They generated income. They gave women economic identities separate from their husbands or fathers. They created space for female expertise and decision-making. And during Christmas, these businesses with activity. The dressmaker who normally made 2 dresses weekly suddenly had orders for 5 because everyone needed something special for holiday parties. The shopkeeper who sold general goods added Christmas cards, ornaments, ribbon, decorative items. The confectioner who made everyday sweets created elaborate sugar plums, candied fruits, special Christmas treats. Women entrepreneurs understood women customers. They knew what middle-class wives needed to create that perfect Victorian Christmas. They knew the pressure, the expectations, the desire to demonstrate competence and taste. So they provided the tools, the goods, the services. They were accomplices in creating luxury Christmas, helping other women execute the domestic performances society demanded. This created an interesting dynamic. Female entrepreneurs serving female consumers, both operating within patriarchal constraints, both using Christmas as an opportunity to exercise limited power. The shopkeeper earned income, gained business experience, built a customer base. The customer created her Christmas display, proved her household management skills, fulfilled her social obligations. Both women participating in an economy that excluded them from most other economic roles. Now, let's talk about what kinds of businesses women actually owned, because the data reveals something important about how gender shaped entrepreneurial options. The most female-dominated sectors were clothing manufacturing and personal services. dressmakers, milliners, seamstress, laundress, lodging housekeepers. Notice what these have in common. They're all extensions of traditional women's work: sewing, cleaning, managing households. The work women were already expected to do for free in their own homes, but monetized and sold to others. This wasn't accident. These were the businesses women could enter without facing massive resistance, because society already believed women were naturally suited for this work. A woman opening a dressmaking shop wasn't threatening male economic territory. She was just professionalizing her natural female skills. But here's what's interesting. Once women established themselves in these appropriate sectors, some of them expanded into less traditional territory. Margaret Getchell didn't stay in her lane. She didn't just manage sales girl. She created marketing strategies, she made executive decisions, and she shaped business vision. She did work that was supposed to be masculine: strategic thinking, financial oversight, brand development, and she wasn't alone. The research shows that economically active married women were more likely than men to be business proprietors, not less likely, more likely. Why? Because once you were running a small business, it was easier to grow it than to stop and take a wage labor job. You had momentum, you had customers, you had knowledge of your market. So women who started as dressmakers opened shops. Women who took in laundry hired assistants. Small enterprises grew into medium ones, and some, like Eliza Tinsley's, grew into large ones. But none of this was easy. Victorian female entrepreneurs faced obstacles at every turn. They couldn't join trade guilds, which controlled access to many professions and provided networking, training, and business support. They had limited access to credit. Banks were reluctant to lend to women. If they needed capital, they borrowed from family, used inheritance money, or operated on minimal resources and reinvested profits slowly. They faced social judgment. A woman running a business was stepping outside her proper sphere. She was neglecting her home, her children, her husband. She was being unfeminine, aggressive, grasping. The criticism was especially harsh for middle-class women. Working-class women had always needed to earn money. Their business ownership was forgiven as necessity. But middle-class women were supposed to have husbands who could support them. A middle-class female entrepreneur implied her husband was failing to provide. So women developed strategies. They ran businesses from home, maintaining the appearance of domestic focus. They emphasized that their work was temporary just until circumstances improved. They chose businesses seen as appropriate for women. They were careful not to out-earn their husbands publicly, and they supported each other. Female shop owners hired female employees. They gave each other advice, connections, customers. They created informal networks since formal ones excluded them. At Macy's, Margaret Getchell hired women whenever possible. She mentored young female employees, giving them advice on advancing their careers. She created an environment where women's contributions were valued. Other female executives followed her model. Cora, who ran Macy's mail-order department, Belle Cushman, head of the lace department, Marie Bowyer, who became superintendent after Margaret. These women weren't tokens. They were building a system where female talent could thrive despite social restrictions. But let's be clear about the limitations. Even successful female entrepreneurs made less than their male counterparts. Even businesses owned by women paid female employees less than male employees. The gender wage gap persisted regardless of who signed the paychecks. And women's business ownership was concentrated in low-profit sectors. Dressmaking, laundry, lodging houses, these weren't high-margin industries. They were labor-intensive, competitive, and offered limited growth potential. The huge retail establishments, the factories, the import-export companies, the financial institutions, almost entirely male-owned, women-owned businesses, men-owned industries. Still, within these constraints, Christmas offered unique opportunities. Because Christmas was women's domain, businesses serving Christmas needs could be female-owned without threatening masculine economic territory. A woman opening a shop selling Christmas cards ornaments, and decorative items. That made sense to Victorian society. She was helping other women fulfill their domestic duties. She wasn't competing with men, she was supporting the home, just from a commercial rather than domestic position. This created a small but significant space for female entrepreneurship, and women used it. By the 1880s, every British and American city had female-owned shops specializing in items for home decoration and celebration, Christmas goods, party supplies, decorative items, gift wrapping services. These businesses were rarely large, most employed only the owner and maybe 1 or 2 assistants, but they provided income, experience, and credibility. A woman who successfully ran a Christmas goods shop for 5 years had proven business acumen. She had financial records, customer relationships, management experience. And some of these women expanded. They added year-round decorative items. They branched into catering, event planning, gift consulting. They found ways to turn seasonal Christmas business into sustainable enterprises. Others used Christmas profits to subsidize learning new trades. A dressmaker who earned extra during Christmas season might invest in new equipment. A shopkeeper might expand inventory, test new product lines, hire permanent staff. Christmas for female entrepreneurs was opportunity season, the time when women's economic activity was most necessary, most profitable, most socially acceptable. But here's what's important to remember. These women weren't just participating in Christmas commerce, they were shaping it. They decided which products to stock, which trends to promote, which innovations to adopt. They were the interface between manufacturers and consumers. They translated foreign fashions for local markets. They advised customers on appropriate gifts, proper decorations, acceptable expenditures. They had real power in determining what luxury Christmas looked like at the consumer level, and they used that power to serve other women, understanding their constraints and needs in ways male shopkeepers often couldn't. This matters because when we talk about who created Victorian Christmas, we can't just point to Queen Victoria and Prince Albert, to Henry Cole and John Horsley, to Roland Macy and F.W. Woolworth. We have to include Margaret Getchell and thousands of women like her. The shopkeepers, the seamstresses, the confectioners, the decorators, the women who took men's ideas and made them accessible, who turned royal affectation into middle-class possibility, who served as consultants, advisors, enablers, and sometimes prophets of what Christmas could become. They were economically necessary, socially constrained, consistently undercompensated, and absolutely essential to building the Christmas we inherited. Margaret Getchell died in 1880, but her legacy lived on. Macy's continued growing, becoming the world's largest department store. Her innovation of creating shopping as experience, of astonishing the customer, of understanding that retail was about emotion and aspiration as much as transaction, that became the foundation of modern retail. And during the holidays, that's when her vision shined brightest. The elaborate displays, the feeling that stepping into Macy's meant stepping into Christmas magic. The understanding that women shoppers wanted more than products. They wanted inspiration, possibility, transformation. That was Margaret. That was her gift. And it came from a woman who understood what other women needed because she was one of them. So yes, Victorian Christmas was built by entrepreneurs, but many of those entrepreneurs were women working within impossible constraints, finding ways to create economic space in a system designed to exclude them. They deserve recognition. They deserve to have their stories told, because they're part of how luxury Christmas became what it is, essential, inescapable, and deeply, irrevocably shaped by female labor, female creativity, and female determination to find power wherever it could be grasped. Now we're reaching the end of this story. We've followed luxury Christmas from Queen Charlotte's first tree through Victoria's 1848 viral moment, through industries that employed and constrained women, through the complicated dynamics of consumption, creation, and control. But there's one more chapter, one more crucial question. What did all of this mean? What's the legacy? How did this Victorian experiment in luxury Christmas shape the world we live in, the holidays we celebrate, the ways we still define women's roles around family and festivity? That's where we're headed next. The conclusion, the reckoning, the moment where we ask, was it worth it? So here's where we are. We've watched Queen Charlotte introduce a Christmas tree in 1800 that nobody cared about. We've seen Victoria and Albert's 1848 illustration go viral. We've followed the industries that emerged: ornaments, cards, food, fashion, retail. All of it built, bought, made and managed by women operating within crushing constraints. But that's just Britain and America. How did this become global? How did a luxury celebration invented by German princesses and popularised by British queens become the dominant December tradition across continents, cultures, religions that had nothing to do with Christianity? The answer, unsurprisingly, is also about women, but in ways that are more complicated, more colonial and more uncomfortable than anything we've discussed so far. Because luxury Christmas didn't just spread, it was exported deliberately as part of empire building. And women were both the ambassadors of this export and the first people it colonised. Let me start with a specific example. India, 1875. British colonial families living in India celebrated Christmas with ferocious determination. They imported Christmas trees from Europe despite the tropical heat. They served roast goose and plum pudding in 100-degree weather. They wore heavy Victorian morning dress and uncomfortable corsets, while their Indian servants fanned them desperately. Why? Because Christmas was Britishness. It was civilization. It was proof that even thousands of miles from home, surrounded by people they considered inferior, British families maintained their superiority through proper celebration of proper holidays. And who was responsible for maintaining this performance? British wives and mothers, the Mem Sahibs as they were called. These women were expected to create perfect Victorian Christmas in impossible conditions. They had to source ingredients that didn't exist locally, train servants who had no familiarity with British traditions, maintain elaborate rituals that made no sense in Indian climate and culture. And they had to do it all while representing British superiority. Their Christmas celebrations were propaganda. They were demonstrations that British culture was better, more sophisticated, more worthy of emulation than local traditions. This is the dark side of luxury Christmas that nobody talks about. It wasn't just a holiday, it was a tool of colonialism, and women were its primary enforcers. But here's what makes this complicated. For many of these British women in India, Christmas was also their only connection to home. It was memory, tradition, identity. They weren't just performing empire, they were desperately holding on to something familiar in alienating circumstances. Letters from British women in India during this period are heartbreaking. They describe the loneliness of Christmas far from family, the difficulty of explaining traditions to children who'd never seen snow, the grief of celebrating without the mothers, sisters, friends who made Christmas meaningful back in Britain. So these women were simultaneously colonizers and casualties. They enforced British culture on colonized peoples while themselves being constrained by the demands of that culture. They had power over Indian servants and zero power in British colonial hierarchy. And the Christmas they exported? It wasn't even authentic British Christmas. It was a frozen, idealized version. The Christmas of 1848, preserved in amber, performed as ritual long after it had evolved in Britain itself. Because that's what happens when culture becomes propaganda. It stops growing. It becomes fixed performance rather than living tradition. This pattern repeated everywhere the British Empire reached. Australia, Canada, South Africa, New Zealand, Hong Kong, Singapore. British colonial families celebrated Victorian Christmas as duty, as identity marker, as proof of civilizational superiority. And local populations learned that participating in British Christmas traditions brought advantages, employment opportunities, social advancement, protection from discrimination. Christmas wasn't neutral, it was the colonizers' holiday, and adopting it signaled acceptance of colonial hierarchy. But something interesting happened. Local populations didn't just adopt Christmas, they adapted it. They took British traditions and transformed them with local practices, creating hybrid celebrations that were neither purely British nor purely indigenous. In the Philippines, Spanish colonial influence combined with later American presence created a Christmas season starting in September lasting 4 months, featuring parols, illuminated star lanterns unknown in Europe. British influence was filtered through multiple colonialisms, creating something entirely new. In Japan, Christmas became a romantic couple's holiday featuring Kentucky Fried Chicken as traditional Christmas dinner, a marketing invention from 1974 that created tradition in single generation. In Mexico, Spanish Catholic Christmas traditions merged with indigenous practices, creating posadas, las pastorelas, entirely different from Victorian British celebration. The point is, Victorian luxury Christmas was exported as a package of specific practices: tree, gifts, cards, dinner, specific food, specific rituals. But it couldn't be perfectly replicated because culture doesn't work that way. Every place that received British Christmas transformed it, and the women who performed these hybrid Christmases, they were navigating even more complex constraints than British or American women. They had to demonstrate sufficient adoption of colonial culture to avoid punishment while maintaining enough indigenous practice to preserve identity. This is exhausting. This is painful. This is what cultural colonialism does. It forces people to perform someone else's traditions while destroying their own, then blames them for not performing authentically enough. Now let's talk about how this affected women specifically. Because Christmas export wasn't just about holidays. It was about exporting Victorian gender roles. When British culture promoted Christmas globally, it also promoted the idea that women's primary role was domestic. That proper women stayed home, managed households, created family celebrations. That women's value came from perfect performance of domesticity. This was revolutionary in many cultures. In numerous societies, women had significant economic roles outside the home. They worked in markets, owned businesses, controlled family finances, participated in community decision-making. British Victorian gender ideology challenged that. It said proper women didn't work outside the home. Proper women didn't engage in commerce. Proper women focused entirely on husband, children, household, and Christmas became the annual examination. Could you create proper celebration? Did you have proper tree with proper ornaments? Did you serve proper food at proper time? Did your children behave properly? Did you demonstrate proper domestic competence? Women who had never been expected to perform this level of domestic theatre suddenly found themselves judged by standards invented in Victorian Britain and exported as universal feminine ideal. This had profound effects. In some colonised societies, women lost economic autonomy as British gender norms were imposed. Market women were pushed toward home-based work. Female traders were considered unfeminine. Women's business ownership declined as British legal frameworks were implemented, frameworks that made it nearly impossible for married women to own property or sign contracts. Christmas export wasn't just about holiday. It was about exporting a complete system of gender oppression disguised as civilization. But again, this is complicated. Because for some women in colonized societies, Victorian Christmas offered escape from different oppressive systems. If local patriarchy was crushing, British patriarchy might offer different opportunities, different constraints that could be navigated differently. Some women found power in performing British domesticity so perfectly that they gained respect, resources, autonomy within their households that local traditions might not have afforded. They used Christmas as stage to demonstrate competence that translated into real influence. This doesn't make it okay. This is navigating between bad options, not choosing good one. But it's the reality of how women operated in colonial contexts. They found agency wherever they could, even within systems designed to limit them. Now let's jump forward. 21st century. Christmas is everywhere in countries that were never British colonies, in cultures that never had contact with Christianity, in places where December is hot, where snow is impossible, where the entire Victorian aesthetic makes zero climatic sense. How did that happen? How did Christmas become global in ways that transcend colonial history? 3 words: American cultural imperialism. In the 20th century, America took Victorian British Christmas and amplified it exponentially, added electric lights, added Santa Claus as marketing tool, added massive commercial apparatus, added Hollywood films showing idealized Christmas that spread globally through cinema. An American Christmas, like British Christmas before it, was exported as package, as aspiration, as standard of civilized celebration. But American Christmas had advantage British Christmas didn't. It wasn't explicitly colonial. It was presented as universal, democratic, available to anyone regardless of background. You didn't have to be Christian to celebrate American Christmas. You just had to consume. This was genius marketing. It removed religious barrier while maintaining commercial one. Anyone could celebrate Christmas as long as they bought the products, adopted the traditions, participated in the economy. And women? Women remained the primary Christmas labourers. They were expected to shop, decorate, cook, manage gifts, create magic. The specific tasks evolved, but the fundamental expectation remained. Women make Christmas happen. This is true globally now. In Japan, in Brazil, in Nigeria, in Thailand, in countries with completely different cultural backgrounds, women bear primary responsibility for Christmas celebration. The holiday that Queen Charlotte had introduced, that Victoria popularised, that thousands of Victorian women built through their labour as consumers, creators and entrepreneurs, has become global feminine obligation. Think about that. A tradition invented by German aristocracy, popularised by British royalty, built by Victorian working women, exported through colonialism and capitalism, has become universal women's work. That's extraordinary. That's also troubling, because here's what this means. Victorian luxury Christmas succeeded beyond anyone's imagination. It became the default December celebration for much of the world. It shaped global consumer culture. It defined modern retail cycles. It created industries employing millions. But it also exported and entrenched specific vision of women's roles. Domestic, nurturing, responsible for emotional labour, of creating joy for others, judged by success in performing these roles, economically productive but undercompensated, creative but constrained, powerful within strict limitations. The Victorian Christmas we've been tracking isn't just historical, it's now. It's the Christmas your mother, grandmother, maybe you yourself were taught to create. The expectations haven't changed much. The tools are different, but the fundamental dynamic remains. Women are still expected to make Christmas magical, to shop perfectly, cook perfectly, decorate perfectly, maintain family harmony, create lasting memories. To do all of this while also working outside the home, because few families can afford Victorian model of women staying home. So modern women are doing what Victorian women did, plus additional labour of wage work, with similar lack of recognition and similar social judgment when they fail to perform perfectly. This is Victorian Christmas's lasting legacy. Not just the tree and the ornaments and the cards and the dinner, but the expectation that women will create celebration for others, that their value is measured by their success in performing domestic magic, that Christmas is somehow naturally women's responsibility rather than shared family labour. And just like Victorian women, modern women navigate this through combination of genuine joy and grinding obligation. They create real magic and real memories, They also exhaust themselves, go into debt, feel inadequate when their Christmas doesn't match magazine ideals or social media performances. The tools have changed, the constraints have evolved, but the fundamental dynamic that Victorian Christmas established remains. Women build Christmas for everyone else. So when we ask, was it worth it, we have to specify, worth it for whom? For the ornament makers in Lauscher earning subsistence wages? For the shop girls standing 14 hours during Christmas season? For the seamstresses sewing mourning clothes while their own families went without proper Christmas? For the brilliant executive forced to work unpaid after marriage? For the colonial wives performing Britishness in alienating climates? For the indigenous women forced to adopt foreign traditions? Or worth it for the consumers who got beautiful celebrations? For the entrepreneurs who built businesses? For the families who created lasting memories? For the children who experienced magic? Both things are true. Victorian luxury Christmas created real joy and real oppression, real beauty and real exploitation, real empowerment and real constraint, always both, never just one. And that's the complexity we inherit. Every time we put up a tree, we're participating in this history. Every ornament we hang connects us to glassblowers in Lauscher, to Kate Greenaway designing cards, to Isabella Beaton systematizing dinner, to Margaret Getchell astonishing customers, to Queen Victoria mourning in black, to colonial wives performing empire, to all the women who built this tradition. We're inheriting their creativity and their constraints, their power and their oppression, their joy and their exhaustion. The question isn't whether to reject Christmas entirely or accept it uncritically. The question is, how do we honour the women who built it while rejecting the systems that exploited them? How do we keep the beauty while discarding the oppression? How do we create celebration that doesn't require anyone's exhaustion or anyone's subjugation? Those aren't easy questions. They don't have simple answers. But they're the questions Victorian luxury Christmas forces us to ask. And maybe asking them, understanding the history, recognizing the labour and creativity and constraint that built this holiday we love, maybe that's where we start. I want to tell you about a photograph. December 1952. A woman stands in her kitchen at 2 a.m. She's wearing a bathrobe, her hair is in curlers, and she's frosting her third batch of Christmas cookies. Around her, wrapped presents, handwritten cards waiting to be mailed, a turkey defrosting in the sink, laundry draped over chairs because she ran out of time to fold it. This photograph was taken by her daughter, who came downstairs for water and found her mother still working. The daughter, now 80 years old, told an interviewer in 2018, "I asked Mum why she was still up. She said, 'Because Christmas doesn't make itself, honey.' Then she smiled and told me to go back to bed. I didn't understand then what that smile cost her." That photograph could have been taken in 1862 or 1922 or 2022, because that's what Victorian luxury Christmas created. An expectation so powerful, so deeply embedded in our culture, that women have been performing it for 170 years. But here's what that 1952 photograph doesn't show. It doesn't show that this woman, like Margaret Getchell LaForge, was brilliant at what she did. It doesn't show that she could have been a business executive, a designer, an entrepreneur. It doesn't show that her Christmas magic required skills in project management, budget allocation, creative design, logistics coordination, emotional intelligence, crisis management. It just shows a tired woman in a bathrobe making cookies at 2 a.m, because that's how we've been taught to see Christmas labour. As natural, as instinctive, as something women just do, rather than complex work requiring real skills. And that invisibility, that's Victorian Christmas's most successful trick. Think about everything we've covered. Queen Charlotte's 1800 tree that nobody cared about, the 1848 illustrated London news that went viral. The explosion of industries, ornaments from Lauscher, cards from Kate Greenaway, dinner instructions from Isabella Beaton, mourning clothes from Jay's Warehouse, department stores from Margaret Getchell. Every single industry built primarily by women's labour and women's creativity and women's consumption. Every single one generating enormous profit, most of which went to men who owned the companies, published the books, held the patents. The women who actually built Christmas, they got subsistence wages or design fees with no royalties, or retail positions with no advancement, or entrepreneurship within sectors deemed appropriate for women. And when they succeeded despite these constraints, when they invented new industries, created new art forms, revolutionized retail, their contributions were minimized, their names were forgotten, their innovations were attributed to men. How many people know Kate Greenaway created the visual language of Victorian Christmas? How many people know Isabella Beeton died at 28, 4 years after publishing the book that defined British cooking for a century? How many people know Margaret Getchell invented modern retail experience decades before anyone gave her credit? Almost nobody, because women's Christmas labour has always been invisible labour. But it gets worse, because Victorian luxury Christmas didn't just exploit the women who built it. It created template for exploiting their daughters, granddaughters, great-granddaughters. It established pattern that continues today. Let me give you some numbers. Modern numbers. 2023 research from the United States. Women spend an average of 15 hours more than men on Christmas preparation. 15 hours. That's nearly 2 full workdays of additional labour that women perform during December. Women purchase 86% of Christmas gifts. Women write 92% of Christmas cards. Women prepare 79% of Christmas meals. Women do 88% of Christmas decorating. And crucially, women report significantly higher stress levels during December than men. They report feeling overwhelmed, inadequate, exhausted. They describe Christmas as obligation rather than joy. This is Victorian luxury Christmas, alive and thriving in the 21st century. But wait, you might be thinking, women in 2023 have choices Victorian women didn't have. They can work outside the home, own property, make their own money, refuse to participate in Christmas labour. Technically, yes. But here's the thing about cultural expectations. They don't need legal enforcement when they have social enforcement. If a woman doesn't send Christmas cards, she's neglecting relationships. If she doesn't bake cookies, she's depriving her children of tradition. If she doesn't decorate perfectly, she's failing at creating magical childhood memories. If she doesn't manage gift-giving, she's being selfish. The judgment is internal and external. It comes from mothers, mothers-in-law, friends, social media, magazines, movies, television and shows. It comes from the woman herself, because she's internalized these expectations as natural rather than constructed. Victorian Christmas succeeded so completely that we can't see it as invention anymore. We think it's tradition. We think it's how Christmas has always been. We think women's responsibility for Christmas is natural, rather than historically specific choice made in the 1840s and 1850s, and that makes it almost impossible to change. But I want to suggest something radical. What if we honoured the women who built Victorian Christmas by refusing to perpetuate the systems that exploited them? What if we said, yes, Kate Greenaway was brilliant, and she deserved royalties for her work. Yes, Isabella Beeton revolutionised cooking instruction, and she deserved to live longer than 28. Yes, Margaret Getchell invented modern retail, and she deserved recognition and compensation equal to male partners. And what if we then said, the best way to honour them is to make sure contemporary women don't face the same exploitation, the same invisibility, the same expectation of unpaid labour performed to perfection? What would that look like practically? It would mean recognising Christmas labour as real work requiring real skills. It would mean distributing that labour equitably rather than defaulting to women. It would mean valuing the people who create celebration rather than taking their labour for granted. It would mean men doing equal amounts of Christmas shopping, cooking, decorating, card writing, gift wrapping, emotion management, not helping with Christmas, not assisting their partners, actually doing equal labour. It would mean teaching children that Christmas happens through effort, not magic, that someone has to plan the meal, buy the ingredients, prepare the food, that someone has to select gifts, wrap them, organize distribution, that someone has to manage the emotions, referee the conflicts, create the joy. It would mean recognizing when Christmas expectations are unrealistic and choosing to scale back rather than exhausting ourselves trying to match impossible standards set by Victorian aristocracy and amplified by modern commercial culture. It would mean being honest about what Christmas costs, not just money, although that too, but time, energy, emotional labor, creative work, and asking whether that cost is distributed fairly or whether it's falling disproportionately on women. This is hard. This requires challenging expectations that feel natural. This means disappointing people who think Christmas should look a certain way. This means accepting imperfection. But consider the alternative. Consider perpetuating Victorian Christmas for another 170 years. Consider your daughters, granddaughters, great-granddaughters standing in their kitchens at 2 a.m, exhausted, making Christmas happen while everyone else sleeps. Is that the legacy we want? Is that the tradition we want to preserve? Or do we want something different? Something that keeps the beauty and joy of Christmas while rejecting the exploitation and invisibility that built it? I think we can honour Victorian women's creativity while rejecting Victorian women's constraints. I think we can love Christmas while changing who does the labour. I think we can preserve tradition while evolving toward equity. But it requires seeing the history clearly. It requires understanding that Victorian luxury Christmas was invented, constructed, built through specific choices made by specific people in specific circumstances. It's not natural. It's not inevitable. It's not the only way Christmas could work. And if it was invented, it can be reinvented. The women who built Victorian Christmas were astonishingly creative. They took royal fashion and turned it into global tradition. They took commercial products and turned them into emotional objects. They took domestic labour and turned it into performance art. They worked within crushing constraints and still created something beautiful. Imagine what they could have created without those constraints. Imagine what contemporary women could create if we distributed Christmas labour equitably and valued their contributions appropriately. That's the possibility Victorian Christmas offers us. Not the possibility of perfect recreation, but the possibility of creative evolution. Not the burden of matching historical expectations, but the freedom to invent new traditions that serve us better. Here's what I want you to remember from this entire series. Victorian luxury Christmas was built by women. Their labour, their creativity, their consumption, their entrepreneurship. They were brilliant, resourceful, innovative people who created industries, art forms, and traditions that shaped global culture. But they did it while being systematically undercompensated, under-recognized, and overworked. They created joy for others while experiencing exploitation themselves. They built celebration that has lasted nearly 200 years, and most of them died without recognition, without reward, without even being remembered. We owe them truth, we owe them acknowledgement. We owe them the respect of seeing their labour as labour rather than as natural feminine instinct. And we owe their descendants, the women creating Christmas today, the possibility of different future. One where Christmas labour is shared equitably, where creativity is compensated fairly, where women's contributions are recognised fully, where celebration doesn't require anyone's exhaustion or anyone's exploitation. That's how we honour the women who built Christmas. Not by perfectly recreating what they made, but by learning from how they made it and choosing to do better. Queen Charlotte stood in front of that first Christmas tree in 1800. She had no idea what she was starting. She couldn't have imagined the industries, the traditions, the global phenomenon that would emerge from that single decorated yew branch. And the woman frosting cookies at 2 a.m. in 1952, she had no idea she was part of historical pattern, stretching back to Lauscher glass blowers and Kate Greenaway's studio and Isabella Beaton's kitchen and Margaret Getchell's department store floor. But we know now, we can see the pattern, we understand the history, we recognize the exploitation alongside the beauty, and that knowledge gives us power, the power to choose differently, the power to honor a tradition while evolving it, the power to keep what serves us and discard what exploits us. Victorian luxury Christmas was first luxury Christmas in history, and the women behind it, they were brilliant, creative, resilient people who deserved better than they got. We can't change their history, but we can change how we understand it, and we can change how we practice it. That's the legacy worth preserving. That's the tradition worth keeping. Not the exploitation, not the invisibility, not the exhaustion, but the creativity, the joy, the connection. Christmas can be beautiful without being oppressive. Celebration can be magical without being exhausting. Tradition can be meaningful without being constraining. But only if we choose to make it so. Only if we see clearly what Victorian Christmas was. Both beautiful achievement and exploitative system. Both creative triumph and exhausting burden. Both something to honor and something to change. The women who built Christmas deserve that honesty, and the women who build Christmas today deserve that future. So this December, when you put up your tree, hang your ornaments, send your cards, prepare your dinner, remember the Lauscher women blowing glass for subsistence wages. Remember Kate Greenaway painting cards without royalties. Remember Isabella Beaton dying at 28. Remember Margaret Getchell working without salary after marriage. Remember Queen Victoria mourning for 40 years. Remember all the women whose names we'll never know who made Christmas happen while history forgot them. And then ask yourself, what would honouring them actually look like? What would real equity look like? What would celebration without exploitation look like? Those are questions worth asking. Because Victorian luxury Christmas isn't just history. It's happening right now every December, in every home where women carry disproportionate burden of creating joy for others. We can do better. We can keep the beauty and discard the oppression. We can preserve the tradition and evolve the practice. We can honor the past and choose different future. That's what the women who built Christmas deserve. That's what their descendants deserve. That's what we all deserve. Thank you for listening to this long, complex, sometimes uncomfortable story about luxury Christmas and the women who built it. Thank you for caring enough to understand the history. Thank you for being willing to see both the beauty and the exploitation. Stories like this matter. History matters. Understanding how traditions were built, who built them, what it cost them, that knowledge matters. Because we can't change what we don't understand. We can't honor what we don't acknowledge. We can't build better futures without learning from complicated pasts. So thank you for your time, your attention, your willingness to think critically about traditions we love. And if this story made you think differently about Christmas, about women's labor, about invisible work, about historical exploitation, about creative resilience, about any of it, then maybe we've honored those Victorian women just a little bit. Maybe we've made their work visible just a little bit. Maybe we've taken one small step toward the equity they deserved and their descendants deserve. That's worth something. That's worth the 2.5 hours we've spent together. There are so many more stories like this. Stories about traditions we think are ancient that were actually invented recently. Stories about labour we think is natural that's actually constructed. Stories about people who built our world while history forgot them. I'll be back soon with another one. Another deep dive into history that's more complicated, more interesting, more relevant than we realised. Another story about the people behind the things we take for granted. Until then, thank you for being here. Thank you for listening. And this December, remember the women who built Christmas, all of them, named and unnamed, remembered and forgotten. They deserve that much. At the very least, they deserve that much.